Section 1. Season 1. The theory that the entire show is being dreamed by one person. There is a house on Spooner Street in a town called Quahog, Rhode Island, and inside that house, something is quietly, structurally wrong. Not wrong in the obvious ways, not the surface-level strangeness of a talking dog or a baby who builds weapons between nap times. Something wrong at a deeper level, woven into the architecture of the show from the very first night it aired on the 31st of January, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33, waiting for someone to notice it. And when you do finally notice it, every episode you have ever seen looks slightly different. Every character behaves in a way that suddenly makes a different kind of sense. The world of Quahog, which always looked like a slightly unhinged version of a real American suburb, reveals itself as something else entirely, something built not by a writing staff but by grief. Let us start at the very beginning, because the theory demands it. The first episode of Family Guy is called Death Has a Shadow. Seth MacFarlane wrote it himself, and he deliberately named the first 4 episodes of the show with death-adjacent words. Death has a shadow, I never met the dead man, chitty chitty death bang, mind over murder. He confirmed this was intentional. Not to signal that the show would be dark in tone, but as something else, a signature, a quiet declaration of what territory the show was actually occupying, beneath the bright colors and the cartoon logic, and the talking dog holding a martini glass. A shadow is not death. A shadow is what death leaves behind when it passes through a life. The long, quiet darkness that spreads in the wake of something that happened and changes the color of everything it falls across. The show's first episode is titled for this aftermath, not for the event itself, but for what the event leaves. A man is not dead in this story. But the man at the center of it is surrounded by something, organized around something, maintained by something that will not let the world around him permanently shatter no matter how much pressure gets applied to it. The theory, in its most fully developed form, argues that the events of Family Guy are not occurring in any real sense. They are a mental construction, a carefully maintained fantasy produced inside the mind of a person experiencing profound and unresolved grief. And every strange thing about the show, every inconsistency, every moment where the logic refuses to cohere, every character who behaves in ways that contradict who they appeared to be 3 episodes earlier, is a feature of that dream, rather than a flaw in the writing. The dreamer, in the most widely circulated version of this theory, which originated on Reddit and was subsequently discussed across multiple fan theory platforms and YouTube channels, is Peter Griffin himself. Not the Peter Griffin of the show, but a real Peter Griffin somewhere underneath the cartoon. A man who experienced something catastrophic, something that destroyed his actual family, and whose mind retreated into a constructed reality where they still exist. The fantasy he built is imperfect, too loud, too strange, too governed by the logic of cartoons rather than the logic of waking life. But it is persistent, it holds together. And the holding together is its most important quality, because the dreamer needs it to hold more than he needs it to make sense. What happened to the real Griffin family? This is where the theory draws its most compelling evidence, and it comes from a detail that has gone almost entirely unremarked across the show's long critical history. In a Season 1 episode, delivered in the middle of a throwaway joke, without weight or emphasis or any surrounding gravity, Peter casually mentions that he and Lois had a son who died. The mention lasts a few seconds. The show builds nothing around it. There is no pause, no shift in tone, no signal that something significant has just passed through the frame. The information surfaces the way real things surface in dreams in the wrong context, with wrong weight, before sliding back below the surface before you can fully grasp it. A dead son, mentioned once. In the first season, never referenced again. Gone, as though the sentence was never completed. If the show is a dream, that detail is the real world bleeding through the membrane of the fantasy. The dreamer cannot fully contain the actual thing that happened. It keeps pushing up through the surface of the constructed world, not as coherent memory, but as fragments, misplaced information arriving in exactly the wrong place, with exactly the wrong casualness, like a word that keeps appearing in conversations where it has no business being. One dead son. One infant genius in the nursery building weapons and plotting against his mother. One family that resets every 22 minutes and never permanently loses anything. These details exist together in the same story. Their coexistence is what gives the theory its grip. Stewie Griffin, the evil genius baby with the British accent and the ray guns and the theatrical obsession with world domination, is, in the Dream Theory's reading, the dreaming mind's attempt to fill the shape of a child it never got to know. The real baby died before any relationship could form, before any personality could emerge, before the question of who this person was going to become could even begin to be answered. And so the sleeping mind, having no actual information to work with, no real child to base the construction on, invents the most extravagant possible version of what a baby could secretly be. Impossibly intelligent. Capable of extraordinary technical feats. Possessed of a fully formed adult consciousness housed inside an infant's body. The dream baby is everything the real baby might have been, amplified beyond all proportion, because the dreamer has only the loss to work from, not the person. He fills the absence with excess, with volume and invention, and the loudest, most impossible thing he can build from nothing. And Stewie's stated goal, the theatrical and obsessive desire to kill Lois, is in this reading displaced emotion. The dreaming Peter carries a complicated relationship with grief and blame and the idea of what might have been prevented, and the dream cannot address this directly, so it routes the feeling sideways through the baby's schemes. Stewie threatens Lois with operatic commitment and fails every single time, because the dream cannot allow Lois to be destroyed. She is structural. She is the anchor around which the family is organized. Without her, the family is not a family, and the dream has nothing to organize itself around. Then there is Brian, the talking white Labrador retriever who drinks martinis and reads books and provides, across the early seasons, the one consistent note of genuine groundedness in a household built on chaos. Brian's function in Season 1 is so precisely calibrated for a specific purpose that the theory finds it impossible to read as accidental. He is the character who pays attention. In a household where Peter is chaos and the children are absorbed in their own worlds, and Lois is permanently occupied with the management of everything, Brian is the one who notices things, who takes Peter seriously when others have stopped, who provides counsel and stays in the room when things get difficult. If the dream is being dreamed by a grieving Peter, then Brian is the idealized companion of the dream, the loyal, attentive presence that the real world may not have provided with sufficient reliability, built into a form that guarantees constancy. Dogs represent unconditional loyalty in the cultural vocabulary most people carry. They do not leave because the situation became inconvenient or the grief became too heavy to witness. A dog stays. And a dreaming mind looking for something that will absolutely not leave builds its most essential companion in the form that most reliably means, I am here and I will remain. The inconsistency about who can hear Stewie and who cannot, one of the most persistently discussed unanswered questions in the show's entire history, fits the dream theory more elegantly than any other available. Framework. In the real world, babies are heard, but not understood. Their needs are managed, but their inner lives are inaccessible. The specific grief of losing an infant before you can know them includes the grief of a connection that was cut before it could be expressed in words, before the baby's personhood could be encountered directly rather than inferred. The dream recreates this dynamic. The baby in the fantasy speaks with the full eloquence of an adult intelligence, and the people around him do not consistently receive what he is saying. Sometimes they hear him. Sometimes they hand him a bottle and smile. The inconsistency is not a writing error. It is the wound expressing itself through the only medium available to it. Seth MacFarlane has offered his own explanation for the inconsistency that all the characters can technically understand Stewie, but choose to ignore him the way adults routinely dismiss what babies say, because adults are too busy or too tired to take a baby's communication seriously. This is a valid surface reading and probably the one that guided day-to-day writing decisions. But it also, perfectly and accidentally, describes the psychology of a parent who knows at some level that their child is trying to communicate something real and cannot slow down enough to receive it. The dream reflects that not paying attention in the only form available, the mother who smiles and does not actually hear. The plot structure of the first episode demonstrates the dream's organizing logic with textbook clarity. Peter does something catastrophically irresponsible. He hides it through escalating dishonesty. The situation builds toward crisis. A magical resolution arrives through Stewie's intervention, and the inexplicable mercy of the judicial system, and everything resets. The family is fine. Nobody is permanently worse off. The structure of this story, irresponsible act concealed, escalation toward disaster, magical resolution, full reset is the template for virtually every episode across the show's entire run. It is not the structure of a story told by someone interested in genuine narrative consequence. It is the structure of a story told by a mind at rest that wants only one thing: reassurance that the family will still be there at the end of the episode. Every episode, they are still there. The coming home is the entire point of the dream. Whatever else the show does, it never violates this one structural rule across 20-plus seasons. Peter commits acts that in any realistic narrative would result in prison or divorce or permanent estrangement, and the family comes home. Stewie nearly takes over the world on multiple occasions, and the family comes home. A giant chicken destroys entire blocks of the neighborhood, and the family comes home. The coming home is not incidental, it is the foundation. The dream was built around it, and everything else, every joke, every cutaway, every increasingly extreme piece of behavior from every character is decoration arranged around the structure of a man who needs, more than he needs anything else, to watch his family survive whatever happens to them this week. The Season 1 animation style reinforces the theory in a way that is easy to miss, because most viewers experience it primarily as a technical limitation. The first season of Family Guy looks rougher than what came later, less clean, more hand-drawn in quality, with a looseness in the character movement and a softness in the color palette. Critics and fans describe this as the show being scrappy or raw. In the context of the dream theory, it is something more specific. It is the quality of a dream that has not yet fully solidified. The dreamer is still constructing the world. The edges are soft because they have not yet been reinforced by years of returning to the same images again and again. The colors are uncertain because the dream is still working out what shade of yellow the house should be, what the sky looks like above Spooner Street, in the particular light of a world that exists only inside a mind that is trying very hard not to wake up. By Season 4, when the show returned from cancellation after 3 years, the animation was harder and more precisely defined. The world had calcified. The dream had spent 3 years in the dark, unmaintained, and when it resumed, it had the quality of a place that has been preserved rather than lived in. This is the narrative consequence of the interruption. The dream did not pick up where it left off. It restarted from the memory of where it left off, which looks like the original but does not quite feel like it, because memory and experience are not the same thing even when they occupy the same space. But in Season 1, the dream is still soft. The world is still finding its shape. Inside it, a baby is building something extraordinary in his nursery, and waiting as he will wait for over 20 seasons for the moment when someone in the house looks up and actually sees what he is doing and understands what it means. Drop a comment right now with where you are in the world and what time it is. I genuinely love knowing where these videos are landing. There is something meaningful to me about the idea of people in different time zones letting this kind of slow, story-shaped content play while the night goes on. Tell me where you are. And if you have not subscribed yet, that button is right there, and it costs you nothing. Now let us keep going. Section 2, Season 2. The theory that Brian Griffin is a portrait of long-term depression and has been since the pilot. Season 2 of Family Guy aired across the 1999 to 2000 television year, and Fox, operating with its customary disregard for shows it did not fully understand, immediately made things harder by moving the show from its dominant post-Super Bowl placement to Thursday nights at 9 o'clock, where it competed directly with Frasier, which was at that point one of the most consistently watched comedies on American television. The audience had trouble finding the show. Fox moved it again. The ratings dropped further. The seeds of the first cancellation were being planted even as the second season was airing, and the people who had loved the first season were learning that loving something on television provides no protection against the network deciding to make it difficult to find. Inside the show, Season 2 was doing something with Brian Griffin that operated so quietly and with such precision that it took years of accumulated hindsight for the fan community to articulate what they had been watching. Not flashy storytelling, not the kind that announces itself with dramatic scenes and orchestral swells and characters who say things out loud about what is happening to them. The kind of storytelling that trusts its audience to notice accumulation without being instructed to look for it. And what the accumulation built, across Season 2 and into every season that followed, was one of the most sustained and specific portraits of long-term depression that primetime animated television has ever produced, specific not in the clinical, textbook sense, but in the lived, recognizable from the inside sense that makes a character feel true rather than observed. To understand why this theory holds together, you need to start with what the show establishes about Brian's history across the first 2 seasons, and think seriously about what that history would do to a person. Brian is a dog in the technical sense of the show's universe, but the show has always treated him as a person, and the theory asks to be evaluated on those terms. His mother abandoned him. He was found as a stray on the streets and picked up by Peter Griffin, which means that at some formative point in his life he was simultaneously homeless and motherless, surviving without the structural support that every other member of the Griffin household has always taken entirely for granted. He now lives in the Griffin house as a permanent houseguest, no formal status, no independent income, no defined relationship with the household other than Peter's continued fondness for him. His tenure here is conditional in a way that nobody ever says aloud, but that the structural arrangement makes obvious. He stays because he is welcome. If he were no longer welcome, he would have nowhere else to go. The novel is never finished. This is established in Season 2 and remains true for the entire run of the show. Faster than the speed of love, the title exists, a synopsis exists that Stewie accurately compares to Iron Eagle 3, and nothing further exists. Brian is a writer who cannot write, an intellectual who cannot produce intellectual work. A person whose ambitions exceed their output by a margin that becomes more painful with every passing season, and the specific texture of that gap. The gap between who you believe yourself to be and what you are actually producing is one of the most recognizable features of the condition the theory is describing. In the Season 2 episode Brian in Love, he visits a therapist to address some disturbing behavior he has been experiencing, behavior that turns out to be connected to suppressed feelings for Lois. The therapy session is played largely for comedy, as most emotionally charged material in the early show was, but something real occurs inside it. Brian, under the gentle pressure of the therapeutic format, begins describing the kind of person he is and the kind of life he is living, and what the description produces is a portrait of someone who is profoundly lonely in a very specific and poorly mapped way. Not the loneliness of having no one, but the loneliness of having people who love him and cannot reach the part of him where he actually lives. Peter cannot follow him into the territory where his mind spends the most time. Lois manages rather than engages. The children are children in the show's framing and do not function as intellectual companions. Brian is surrounded by genuine warmth and is entirely alone with his interior life. The most mentally capable person in the household has no adequate counterpart for the conversations that matter most to him. This particular form of loneliness intelligence in the wrong environment, connection without comprehension, produces a specific kind of suffering that resists conventional description because the person experiencing it is not isolated in any conventional sense. They have relationships, they have warmth around them. They are embedded in the routines of shared domestic life, but there is a layer of their inner world that receives no visitors. And living with an unvisited interior for long enough produces changes that look, from the outside, like arrogance or pretension or disengagement, when what is actually happening is the callus forming over a wound that has been exposed for too long without adequate treatment. Brian's drinking present from Season 1, becoming more contextually significant in Season 2, is the adaptation he has built for this specific discomfort. Alcohol, in the cultural vocabulary the show is drawing on, does a particular thing. It reduces the gap between who you are and who the people around you need you to be. It makes it easier to participate in conversations that do not meet you at your actual level. It softens the edges of an intelligence that, in its unmodified form, keeps you perpetually, almost imperceptibly outside every room you enter. For Brian, the martinis are not a stylistic flourish or a character detail deployed for comedy purposes. They are a coping mechanism for a chronic form of psychic discomfort used consistently enough over long enough a period to constitute something more significant than a habit. The Reddit user Grandmaster Sexay, whose argument has been discussed and elaborated across multiple fan theory platforms over the years, made a compelling neurological observation about Brian's arc that the theory incorporates. Dog brains, being structurally different from human brains in specific ways that affect memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and executive function, would process the effects of chronic heavy alcohol consumption differently than human neurology would, and with potentially more pronounced and faster progressing results. The behavioral effects of long-term alcohol-related neurological change extrapolated into the show's internal logic, where Brian is simultaneously a dog and a person, would include the specific and progressive erosion of the precise capacities that made him valuable as the voice of reason in the early seasons: accurate self-assessment, the ability to notice and hold the gap between your stated values and your actual behavior, and sustained empathy toward others that is not performance. These are the capacities that go first, and they are exactly the capacities Brian loses, season by season, in ways that are measurable and specific if you are tracking them. Season 2, Brian still has the corrective function working. He can look at himself with something approaching accuracy. He is capable of the kind of self-awareness that produces genuine humility rather than its performed counterpart. The uncomfortable kind of humility that requires holding the possibility of your own failure without immediately converting it into aggression toward whoever named it. You can see this in the way he talks about the novel in these early seasons. When it comes up, he is genuinely embarrassed by it. Not theatrically, not as a joke, but with the real uncertainty of someone who does not know whether the thing they are working on is good, who holds the possibility of failure without yet having developed the defensive architecture that will later convert that uncertainty into something harder and more damaging. There is also the matter of what the show establishes about Brian's mother, not just the abandonment itself, which is noted in Season 2, but the specific form of it, and the specific manner in which Brian encounters its aftermath as an adult. His mother left him. He survived on the streets until Peter found him. In a later episode that fills in the backstory in more detail, Brian discovers that his mother died and that her remains were subsequently incorporated into a piece of furniture, a coffee table, which he is then required to navigate around at a family gathering, making polite conversation in a room that contains the physical remnants of the person who left him. This is one of the most specific and structurally Baroque images of unresolved grief in the history of animated television. The person who shaped the wound by leaving has been turned into something you bump into at parties. There is no way to process that which leaves you intact. You can only carry it forward. The carrying is what Season 2 is about, in Brian's story. He is carrying the mother who left, the novel that will not advance, the loneliness that the alcohol manages but cannot cure, and the knowledge that his place in this house is contingent on remaining the most useful version of himself, the grounded, thoughtful, reliable companion at exactly the moment when everything he is carrying makes being that version harder and harder to sustain. Season 2 is the season where you can still see him managing the weight, where the management is still mostly working, where the performance of the reasonable, intellectually present companion is still close enough to who he actually is to be sustainable without extraordinary effort. Every season after that is the story of the distance growing between the performance and the person, the gap widening, the defensiveness replacing the honest uncertainty, the arrogance expanding to fill the space left by accomplishments that did not arrive, the relationships failing in patterns that become more predictable and more painful the more precisely you understand the mechanism driving them. All of it accumulating quietly, specifically, without dramatic announcement until the show gives the whole thing a name in the Vault episode of Season 8, which is where this series of theories is building, and which we will reach in the right order. Section 3, Season 3. The theory that Stewie does not actually want to kill Lois. Season 3 of Family Guy aired from 2001 to 2002, and it is the last season of what the fan community almost unanimously considers the golden era. It contained some of the most carefully constructed and most beloved episodes in the show's history, episodes that held the balance between chaos and warmth, with a precision that the revival seasons would struggle to match. It also ended with the show being canceled by Fox, for reasons that had everything to do with scheduling decisions and nothing to do with quality. The cancellation was an administrative event, not a verdict. Its consequence was 3 years of absence, during which the show existed only in reruns and in the memories of people who had loved it. Inside Season 3, Stewie Griffin is fully and without ambiguity the evil genius baby. He builds weapons and deploys them. He schemes against Lois with theatrical commitment. He constructs time machines and mind control devices and weather alteration systems in the nursery between feedings. The world domination ambitions are present and active and given full creative attention. Every scene with Stewie in Season 3 carries the specific energy of a character who is completely committed to a project, and the comedy of that commitment, this tiny infant with a bomb villain's elocution and a genuine interest in the enslavement of humanity, is executed with more consistency and more inventiveness than anything the show would subsequently attempt to replace it with. But the theory generated by Season 3 is this: Stewie does not actually want to kill Lois. He has never actually wanted to kill Lois. The Matricide Project is, from its very beginning, a displacement behavior, a way of expressing something that an infant lacks both the vocabulary and the developmental architecture to say directly. That something, the theory argues, is a specific and urgent and frustrated need to be genuinely seen and known by his mother, not managed, not scheduled, not attended to in the functional, logistical sense in which caregivers attend to infants. Seen in the fuller sense, encountered as the particular, extraordinary, impossible to fully grasp person he actually is, rather than as a developmental phase to be supervised and moved through. The evidence for this theory is structural rather than textual. It does not come from a line of dialogue where a character states the interpretation directly. It comes from the pattern of how Stewie's plans end, which is always, in every single instance, in failure, and from the specific quality of what produces each failure. Stewie is genuinely capable. This is not a debatable point within the show's internal logic. His technology functions, his time machine works, his mind control devices produce the results they are designed to produce when aimed at other targets. He is not limited by capability when his plans against Lois fail. The capability is present. What is not present is the follow-through, and the follow-through is consistently, specifically, derailed by Lois herself doing something warm and particular, and specifically maternal at exactly the moment when the plan requires Stewie to stop hesitating and execute. Watch Season 3 with this framework active. Stewie reaches the moment of execution. Lois picks him up with genuine, unrehearsed tenderness. Stewie is about to deploy the weapon. Lois says something to him not generically, not as a caregiver going through the motions, but with the specific attentiveness of someone who is actually present to the particular child in front of them. He is mid-villain monologue and she laughs at something he does, specifically and with real amusement rather than the distracted laugh of a parent filling silence. In every one of these moments, something changes in Stewie's behavior. The plan evaporates. The weapon goes unused. And he mutters about next time with a quality in the delivery that sounds, if you listen carefully, less like genuine renewed menace and more like a child, reminding himself of the performance he is supposed to be sustaining, because the performance has become the only available substitute for the thing it is displacing. Displacement behavior, in psychological terms, is what occurs when the real need is too vulnerable or too inaccessible to be addressed directly, so the emotional pressure behind it redirects toward a substitute target. The substitute can be engaged with without the specific exposure that the real target would require. For Stewie, the weapons and the schemes allow him to be in full theatrical engagement with Lois without being actually exposed to the risk of the real thing he wants, which is genuine contact, the specific kind of contact that requires someone to see you truly and respond to what they have seen rather than to what they expect or need to see. The specific weapons Stewie builds are a map of the underlying psychology. Ray guns represent the need for power in an environment of absolute structural powerlessness. He cannot reach the counter, cannot open the refrigerator, cannot make anyone do anything through normal channels. The ray gun is the fantasy correction. I am not as helpless as I appear. I have something you should take seriously. Built by someone who needs to be taken seriously and has not yet received adequate evidence that this will happen through ordinary means. Mind control devices represent the frustration of not being heard at the level at which he is communicating. When Stewie speaks, people respond to the surface rather than the substance. They manage the behavior without encountering the person producing it. The mind control device is the fantasy correction. If I can compel your response, I do not have to wait for you to choose to give it. Built by someone who has learned that relying on others' willingness to be present is unreliable, and who has decided to engineer an alternative to that unreliability. The time machine is the theory's most important object and will be addressed in full in the Season 10 section. But even here in Season 3, it is worth noting, time machines do not destroy and do not control people. They control time. They give their user the ability to return to the moment before the damage occurred, to undo what has been done, to restore what has been lost. This is the most specific fantasy available to someone in grief. The idea that the past is still accessible, that loss is reversible, that the moment before the bad thing happened still exists somewhere and can be returned to. The theory will return to what this means for Stewie's specific losses later. The most revealing detail in Season 3 is brief and easy to miss because the show does not frame it thematically. There is an episode in which Stewie, left alone with Lois for an extended period, is simply happy, not plotting, not calculating, not reaching for anything. He laughs at something she says specifically, in the way you laugh when something genuinely surprised you. He allows himself to be held without converting the holding into tactical opportunity. The scene passes without the show commenting on it. But in the context of the theory, it is the unguarded moment, the frame where the displacement behavior is not active, and the thing it has been protecting shows its actual face. What that thing wants is simple. The simplest want available to a person, to be known. Not feared, not obeyed. Known as the specific, extraordinary, impossible to fully grasp person he actually is, by the person who is most responsible for knowing him, who picks him up and changes him and feeds him, and has absolutely no idea that the child in her arms is the most complex and capable person in the household. The cancellation that ended Season 3 is, in this reading, the story's most structurally meaningful fact. The child who wanted to be seen was canceled before the story could resolve. And when the show returned in 2005, it returned with a Stewie who was already changing, already showing more of his emotional interior, already beginning the long drift toward the softer, more relatable version of the character that would become dominant from Season 4 onward. The 3-year gap is the gap in which the character, inside the logic of the story, quietly admitted to himself what he had actually been asking for all along. Section 4. Season 4. The theory that one specific episode permanently changed Peter Griffin. Season 4 of Family Guy premiered on the 1st of May 2005, after 3 years of absence, and the return was celebrated with genuine enthusiasm by the fan base that had built itself around Adult Swim reruns and DVD sales during the hiatus. Fox placed the returning show at the center of animation domination. The premiere episode drew around 7.9 million viewers, an impressive number for any returning show, and a remarkable one for a show coming back from cancellation. The hype was real. And then, 6 episodes into the season, the show did something that looked like a comedy premise but functioned as a permanent alteration of the show's central character. The episode is called Petarded. Lois, not wanting Peter to embarrass himself during a neighborhood Trivial Pursuit game, secretly substitutes his card deck with a preschool edition. Peter answers questions like what color is a fire truck and wins the game, immediately concluding that he is a genius. He enters a local intelligence competition. The official assessment comes back. Peter Griffin's IQ places him just below the legal threshold for mental retardation. He is on paper in this episode officially intellectually disabled. The episode plays this for comedy. There are jokes about Peter leaning into his diagnosis, scenes involving the Department of Child and Family Services questioning whether Lois is a fit guardian for someone with Peter's official cognitive status. And then the episode ends. The lesson is glanced at and not taken seriously, and the show moves on. Except the show did not actually move on from what the episode established. The TV Tropes page for Petarded contains a notation that describes it as the characterization click moment for Peter Griffin, the precise episode that marks his official transition from a dim-witted but fundamentally well-meaning bumbling dad to a psychopathic man-child. This is a structural analysis, not an opinion, and it holds up when you track the show forward. The episode gave the writing room a narrative permission structure consciously employed, or not, that was used across every subsequent season to escalate Peter's behavior without ever being required to hold him accountable. At the level of a neurotypical adult character. The distinction between Peter in seasons 1 through 3 and Peter in seasons 5 and beyond is not primarily about his intelligence, even though his depicted intelligence does decline. It is about his relationship with the emotional reality of the people around him. Early Peter does genuinely stupid things. He is impulsive, underthinking, prone to catastrophic decisions made in the absence of adequate reflection, but he cares about the consequences of those decisions. When he realizes he has hurt Lois, the realization actually lands on him. He feels something about it, tries in his clumsy way to address it, apologizes. When he understands that his children have been affected by something he did, there is a visible response. He is a good person who is very bad at being a good person, and that specific combination, goodness without competence, is what made the early character work. The heart was there even when the judgment was absent. Post-petarded Peter gradually loses the heart, not in a scene, not in a moment the show frames as significant. Gradually, across season 5 and with increasing velocity in every season after it, the character who used to feel bad about hurting the people he loved becomes a character who either does not notice the hurt or notices it and keeps moving without reaction. The examples accumulate through the later seasons. Peter pushes Lois underwater to escape what he believes is a shark. Peter steals his infant son's Halloween candy. Peter encourages his best friend Joe to betray his marriage. Peter sabotages Brian's professional opportunities out of jealousy. None of these are the actions of a loving idiot making bad decisions because he cannot think clearly. They are the actions of someone for whom the pain of others has stopped registering as a relevant input into his decision-making process. The theory proposes that the petarded diagnosis created a narrative loophole that the writing room used consciously or not to detach Peter from the moral accountability that had always been part of his characterization. If he is officially below a certain cognitive threshold, the show cannot be expected to hold him to the ethical standards of a neurotypical adult. The protection established by the diagnosis allowed the escalation to proceed without a ceiling. There is a real neurological parallel that makes this more specific than simple character critique. Certain kinds of frontal lobe dysfunction resulting from traumatic brain injury, specific developmental conditions, or the cumulative effects of chronic substance use over time produce a recognizable behavioral profile. Retained basic functional competence in familiar environments, combined with significant erosion of the precise internal capacities that govern moral life. Accurate consequence assessment, sustained empathy toward others that goes beyond surface-level social performance. The emotional connection between understanding that you have hurt someone and feeling something about that understanding. These functions degrade first, and they are exactly the functions that Peter loses, season by season, in the years following Petarded. The most concentrated evidence for this reading comes from a season 10 episode in which Meg delivers her confrontation of the family, describing Peter's behavior toward her in accurate and specific terms. Peter's response to hearing this account is laughter, not defensive laughter. Not the redirected laughter of someone covering embarrassment, but laughter that suggests genuine amusement at the content of what he is hearing. The person he was in season 1 would have been devastated by that speech. Would have felt its weight even if he could not immediately act on it. The later Peter does not feel the weight, because the mechanism that would have registered it, the one that made him a good person, who was bad at being good, has been progressively eroded since the day an episode gave a judge the authority to write down what was already quietly happening to the character from inside. Section 5. Season 5. The theory that Quagmire has an unacknowledged moral framework. Season 5 aired from September 2006 to May 2007, and Glenn Quagmire, the lecherous neighbor, the running gag about predatory behavior, the character most consistently singled out by critics as the show's most morally compromised regular, does something in the season finale that makes everything about him more complicated than the show's surface treatment usually allows. In the episode Meet the Quagmires, Death gives Peter the ability to go back in time to his youth, with full knowledge of who he will become. Peter makes different choices in the altered timeline. The ripple effects produce a world where various characters end up in different situations. In this alternate version of events, Quagmire is married to Molly Ringwald. He is domestically settled in a way the main timeline Quagmire has never been. He is visibly and specifically content. And then the timeline is restored and the main universe Quagmire is returned, alone, maintaining his life exactly as he always has, with the practiced ease of someone committed to a choice. The theory this episode generates asks the most direct possible question. Given that the alternate timeline proves his capacity for a different kind of life, why does he live the way he lives? What is the actual logic, not the comedy logic, not the surface logic, but the character logic underlying the persona the show has built around him? The answer the theory proposes is that Quagmire is not unreflective. He is, under the persona, someone who has made a considered and largely unspoken decision about what role he is going to occupy in the social ecosystem of Spooner Street. Someone in the group needs to visibly carry the darkness to embody and perform the worst impulses that every member of the group experiences in some form and suppresses with varying degrees of success, so that those impulses remain nameable and visible, rather than going underground where they are less acknowledged and more dangerous. Quagmire has decided to be that person, not out of masochism, not out of genuine absence of shame, but out of a specific and rarely credited form of social intelligence that understands what groups need from the person willing to name what everyone else is feeling but not saying. Season 5 provides the evidence. In Airport 07, Peter sabotages Quagmire's plane out of jealousy and causes it to crash a genuinely serious act, one in which real people could have been hurt, and one that destroys Quagmire's career. Quagmire's response, while angry, is more measured than any reading of him as purely impulsive could account for. He does not retaliate at the level the offense warrants. He does not end the friendship. He absorbs the consequence and continues. This is not the behavior of someone with no moral framework. It is the behavior of someone who has made a calculated assessment of proportionality and relationship value and decided, on the basis of that assessment, to accept a cost rather than escalate. The Navy background is not incidental to this reading. Quagmire served as a Navy ensign. He met Peter in the Navy. He has a professional history that required consistent competence under pressure and the specific accountability that comes from being genuinely responsible for other people's safety. Someone formed by that environment does not accidentally become the character Quagmire presents as on the surface of the show. The persona is chosen, it is maintained by effort. And the alternate timeline in the Season 5 finale is the single episode where the show makes visible, without commenting on it directly, what the maintaining of that persona cost him. Section 6, Season 6, the theory that the simulation never ended. Season 6 aired from 2007 to 2008 and produced the show's most ambitious two-part episode. Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie, the 100th and 101st episodes of the series. These episodes finally delivered on the show's central ongoing promise. Stewie actually follows through, actually shoots Lois, actually achieves the goal he has been describing since the pilot. The two-parter commits to the premise with dramatic and tonal weight the show had not brought to anything in several seasons. Then it ends with the words simulation over on screen. None of it happened. Stewie was running a computer scenario. The family is fine. Everything resets. The show acknowledges the cheat in the episode's own dialogue. Brian wonders whether a hypothetical outside viewer would feel cheated by the reveal. Stewie argues that a simulation is categorically different from a dream sequence, and therefore exempt from that criticism. Brian says the outside viewer would be angry. And as Stewie begins his counter-argument, the scene cuts to Black Midward, a self-referential Sopranos reference. The show made a joke at its own expense about the unsatisfying nature of the reveal it just used. The theory starts with one question. How do we know the simulation ended? Not in the narrative sense, where the show tells us it ended and we accept it because the show told us. In the structural sense, what evidence exists, in the actual behavior of the show in the seasons that followed, that we are watching the real Griffin family's real timeline rather than an ongoing experimental scenario generated by Stewie's computer? The theory's answer is that no such evidence exists. In fact, the behavior of the show after Season 6 is more consistent with a continuing simulation than with the authentic continuation of the family's real life. Consider what changes in Stewie's character from Season 7 onward. The world domination plots fade progressively until they nearly disappear. The attempts against Lois slow to negligible frequency. The evil genius baby who wanted to kill his mother is replaced by someone softer, more emotionally available, more interested in his friendship with Brian and the navigation of his personal identity than in the mechanics of global conquest. The show's explanation is that the writers felt the evil baby joke had run its course. The theory offers a different reading. The first simulation run demonstrated that the violent configuration produces bad outcomes for Stewie. The simulation recalibrated. It set new parameters, a Stewie not committed to violence, a Stewie building genuine emotional connections, and ran a second scenario. The Family Guy of Season 7 and every season after it is that second scenario. This reframing does not require dismissing the later seasons as simply worse, though they are often qualitatively weaker. It requires reading them differently, not as the authentic continuation of the Griffin family's story, but as successive iterations of Stewie's ongoing modeling project. The inconsistency of character behavior that critics correctly identify as one of the show's significant post-revival problems. Peter, who is somewhat caring in one episode and completely indifferent in the next. Brian, who holds a firm position one week and abandons it entirely the following week, is not a writing flaw under the simulation theory. It is the signature of a system testing variables rather than telling a coherent story. The experimental apparatus produces inconsistency as a feature, not a bug. Each parameter adjustment creates a slightly different version of the characters, and those versions do not carry their previous settings reliably from run to run. The ending of the two-parter contains the theory's most resonant detail. Stewie's final sentence is cut off mid-word. The scene goes to black while he is still speaking. The Sopranos joke makes this funny, but it is also a structural claim. The sentence was not completed. The simulation was not terminated. The cut to black was not an ending. It was a scene transition the audience was set up to read as an ending. The show that aired afterward is the continuation of an unfinished sentence, playing out in the dark, generating seasons of television as the output of a process that has not yet produced a conclusion. The real Stewie is still in the chair in his bedroom, still running the numbers, still watching scenarios play out, and what we call Family Guy from Season 7 through to the present is his research. Section 7, Season 7. The theory that Cleveland Brown left because he saw where the group was heading. Season 7 aired from September 2008 to May 2009 and was the last season of Cleveland Brown as a regular cast member before his departure for The Cleveland Show. The in-universe reason was a fresh start after the collapse of his marriage. The production reason was Fox wanting a new Seth MacFarlane property. Both of these explanations are real. The theory in this section operates at a different level. It is about what Cleveland Brown, as a character with a specific and traceable psychology, would have been experiencing in Season 7 that made departure feel necessary in a way that was about protecting something in himself. Early Cleveland seasons 1 through 3 was the group's stabilizing presence. Not the most dramatically interesting character in the conventional sense, not the one generating spectacular narrative fireworks. He was the one who did not match energy when energy was being raised in a dangerous direction. He de-escalated. He absorbed. He provided the quiet, consistent counterweight to Peter's chaos without confronting it directly. This is not a passive quality. It is a specific form of strength that requires constant, quiet effort to maintain the effort of choosing again and again, not to escalate when escalation would be the easier response, of providing steadiness when the situation is actively attempting to destabilize you. By Season 7, that effort was becoming more expensive. Peter's behavior had been escalating in the specific ways the petarded section of this analysis described, and the situations Cleveland was being asked to absorb and normalize had become harder to hold from his usual position. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that belongs specifically to the person who provides emotional regulation for a group. The exhaustion of managing the gap between what you are actually feeling and what you are expressing, of continuously translating someone else's disruptive behavior into something the group can absorb without fracturing. That exhaustion compounds over time, and it compounds faster when the behavior you are translating becomes more extreme, faster than your capacity to translate it grows. There is a kind of departure that does not announce itself, that happens instead as a series of incremental withdrawals, so gradual they are nearly invisible until the accumulated direction becomes unmistakable. The person stops arriving with the same completeness. They are present in the room, but something that used to be fully available is now held back. Cleveland's presence in Season 7 has this quality. He shows up, he participates. But if you compare his engagement in Season 1 episodes to his engagement in Season 7 episodes, something in the texture has changed. He is there, but not all the way there. Some part of him has already begun the process of leaving. The meta-joke moment in Season 8 where Cleveland announces he is getting a spin-off framed as winking self-awareness about the production decision being made contains, stripped of the comedic framing, a simple in-universe statement: Cleveland is going, not being transferred, choosing to go. The Cleveland Show, received as the continuation of Cleveland's character arc, shows what he found when he left. In Stoolbend, the specific combination of gentleness and consistent steadiness he had always brought to his relationships produces different results than it had in Quahog. He is not the eternal absorber in a group organized around someone else's chaos. He is a person building a life in conditions that actually fit who he is. The showing up does not require the same constant managed translation it required on Spooner Street. His return to Family Guy in Season 12, when the Cleveland Show ended, is the theory's most textured moment. He came back, having known the alternative, having had 4 years to experience what a different configuration of the same essential self felt like. He returned. The theory does not read this as the failure of the alternative or as proof that Quahog was better than he had understood. It reads it as the specific, complicated choice that many people make when they return to difficult things they left. The choice made with full awareness of the cost and full acknowledgement of what the thing also contains. The history is real. The friendship is real for all its damage. Love expressed badly and received imperfectly is still love. Cleveland knew this. He came back knowing it. And the knowing is what makes his return a different kind of presence than his original tenure. The presence of someone who chose to be there, rather than someone who simply had nowhere else to go. Section 8. Season 8. The theory that the episode Brian and Stewie is the show's truest moment. Season 8 of Family Guy aired from September 2009 to May 2010. It opens with Road to the Multiverse, the Disney Universe sequence, the Robot Chicken parody, some of the most fluid animation the show ever produced, and it is a genuinely excellent opening. The kind that reminds an audience why they fell in love with something. And then the season ends, 9 months later, with Brian and Stewie. Brian and Stewie is an entirely different kind of excellent. Quieter, more contained, more honest than anything that preceded it in the show's 8-year run. The premise is its own description. Brian and Stewie are accidentally locked in a bank vault together overnight. There are no cutaways, there are no external events driving the story, there are no other characters. There is the vault, and the two of them, and 22 minutes of conversation that moves from comedy through argument and arrives somewhere the show had not previously demonstrated it was capable of reaching. The episode was written by Gary Janetti, one of the original Season 1 writing staff who understood these characters from their foundations rather than from accumulated familiarity. This matters for what the theory asks you to notice about the episode. What makes Brian and Stewie work is not the kind of craft that produces effective shock comedy or memorable individual gags. It is the kind that knows exactly who these two people are when everything performative has been stripped away, and trusts that knowledge to carry the weight of 22 minutes without any of the scaffolding the show had spent years becoming dependent on. The theory built around this episode is structural. It argues that this episode is the destination that all of Brian's characterization was always moving toward across 8 seasons, and that reading it as such transforms the meaning of everything the show built around Brian before it. The moment the theory centers on comes when Brian, drinking steadily since they were locked in, reveals to Stewie that he keeps a firearm in a safety deposit box located within the vault they are currently occupying. When Stewie asks why, Brian's answer is direct and unadorned. Sometimes he thinks about using it on himself. Not as an active plan or an acute crisis, as something that has been present in the background of his thinking, an option he has not permanently closed. He keeps it in the bank vault rather than in the house because the vault creates distance. The walk to the bank is the interval in which the impulse has the opportunity to pass before it can be acted on. The show does not build a dramatic scene around this disclosure. There is no orchestral shift signaling how the audience should feel. Brian says it in the specific, matter-of-fact register of someone who has been living with a fact for long enough that the living with it has become a feature of daily functioning rather than an emergency. This is not a crisis, it is a condition. It has been present for a while. He has a system for managing it. The system involves a bank. Every prior season of Brian's story looks different in the light of this disclosure. The martini that was always in his hand across 8 years of episodes, the novel that never advanced past a title and a summary that invites comparison to a mediocre action film. The specific flatness in how he talked about his mother when the subject arose, not anger, not grief, but something more integrated than either, the flatness of someone who has been living alongside a wound for so long, the wound has become ambient rather than acute. All of it, in the context of what the Vault episode says plainly, is the behavior of a person who has not fully committed to being here, who has been present in the provisional way of someone who has not permanently ruled out the alternative, who has, as a practical matter, built a structural buffer between himself and the option the Vault that requires deliberate effort to access, the deliberate effort providing the interval in which the impulse passes. Stewie's response is the second half of what makes the episode the theory it generates. He does not treat the disclosure as a joke. He does not deploy one of his theatrical emotional registers. He tells Brian, in the quiet voice of someone who has not yet learned to protect their own sincerity with irony or performance, that Brian matters to him, that if Brian were absent from the world, something irreplaceable would be lost. This is Stewie speaking from underneath the displacement behavior, from the place the Season 3 theory identified as what the weapons were always protecting. He has found the person who hears him at his actual level. He is telling that person that the hearing is something he cannot do without. The firearm goes back in the box, the episode ends, they go home. And the friendship between Brian and Stewie after the Vault is a different thing from the friendship before it, even when the show does not always write it as such in the episodes that follow. Brian knows that Stewie stayed present when confronted with the full weight of what Brian is carrying, rather than retreating into comedy or performance. Stewie knows that Brian trusted him with the specific thing he had apparently not trusted anyone else with. Both of them know that the friendship, after the Vault, has survived a test that most friendships never encounter. That knowledge is the foundation on which everything between them in the subsequent seasons rests, whether the writing room always builds on it carefully or not. The Back to the Pilot episode in Season 10, in which Brian and Stewie travel back to the very first episode and watch the original Griffins, reads differently in this light. They are watching who they were before everything the intervening seasons made them. Neither of them is yet the person they became. The episode plays this for nostalgia. The theory reads it as two people watching the version of themselves that existed before the thing that changed them, with full knowledge of what the change cost and what it produced, and staying in the room with both the cost and the production, without looking away from either. Section 9, Season 9. The theory that Meg Griffin is the only character experiencing continuous time. Season 9 of Family Guy aired from September 2010 to May 2011 and contains the episode Seahorse Seashell Party, a hurricane special that is remembered primarily for the moment when Meg, pushed past the limits of reasonable endurance, delivers to her family the most accurate and devastating account of who they are and what living with them has cost her that the show had ever produced or would produce again. She does not perform anger. She reports facts. She addresses Peter, describing his behavior toward her with specificity and accuracy, and no embellishment beyond what the show had actually depicted over 9 seasons. She addresses Lois, describing what Lois has allowed and what the allowing communicated. It is the clear, composed testimony of someone who has been keeping the record for a long time and has decided to present it not in an outburst, not in a moment of emotional overwhelm, but with the particular quality of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say by living through it thousands of times and who has finally decided that the time to say it is now. And then the episode ends in the way that produced genuine unease in a significant portion of the audience. After Meg's confrontation destabilizes the family's usual dynamics, with the other members turning on each other in the absence of their designated absorber, Meg goes to Brian and rescinds everything she said. She tells him that her role in the family is to absorb the accumulated damage so that everyone else can function. She accepts this. She goes back to her room. The theory in this section uses this episode as its primary evidence and extends backward across the entire 9-season history. The theory is structural. Meg Griffin is the only character in Family Guy who experiences genuine, continuous, accumulative time. Every other character operates on what the theory calls the episodic reset. They reconstitute between episodes in ways that make each new installment function as though the previous ones did not fully happen. Peter does something that reveals something true about his character in Episode 3. In Episode 4, the revelation is gone. Brian grows or is confronted with something difficult in one episode, and in the next is precisely who he was before any of it happened. Lois has moments of genuine reckoning about her marriage or her children that leave no trace in subsequent episodes. Even Stewie, whose arc this analysis has traced across multiple sections, does not carry the full weight of his experiences from one installment to the next in any consistent way. Meg does. Meg, across 9 seasons by the time of Seahorse Seashell Party, is visibly someone who has lived through the previous 8. Her posture carries them. The specific quality of resignation that has become her default state is not a fixed trait she was written with from the beginning. It is the product of an accumulated history that the show did not plan for her to have in quite this form, but that the accumulation of episodes produced anyway, because Meg, unlike the other characters, was built in a way that does not fully reset. This makes Meg, by the logic of the theory, the most realistic character in the show. Not the most likable, not the most dramatically compelling in the conventional sense. The most realistic in the deepest available meaning of the term because her emotional reality functions according to the rules that govern how actual people move through actual time. Forward, carrying everything, unable to select which experiences to retain and which to release, the way the other characters appear to be able to do. The Seahorse Seashell Party ending is the theory's most painful evidence. The truth is spoken 9 seasons of truth, assembled into testimony with real accuracy and real force. And then the character who spoke it is asked to take it back, to re-accept the arrangement, the truth disrupted, to go back into the position of silent accumulator so that the other characters can continue functioning in the way they have always functioned. The show frames this as Meg voluntarily sacrificing herself for the family's stability. The theory names what that framing actually describes. Someone being returned to a harmful position so that the people causing the harm do not need to change. This is the only possible structural outcome, given the nature of the show. The other characters cannot genuinely change and hold that change, because they operate on the reset. They cannot carry what Meg told them into the next episode. They cannot become different people who treat her differently based on what her confrontation revealed, because the format will not allow it. The only way the family can remain stable across episodes is for Meg to reabsorb the truth and go back to her room. Her continuity, her inability to reset the way the other characters do, is the family's stability mechanism. Her memory of what happened is the cost of everyone else's ability to forget. In the context of the dream theory from Section 1, Meg is the detail that does not fully obey the dream's rules. The other characters reset because the dreamer needs them to, but Meg does not reset. She carries. The theory proposes that Meg represents the point where the dreamer's control of the fantasy fails. The place where guilt that is too particular and too real bleeds through the constructed surface in the form of a character who cannot be made to forget what happened to her because the dreamer himself cannot fully forget what he failed to do for her. Section 10, Season 10, the theory that Stewie's weapons are all psychological projections. Season 10 of Family Guy aired from 2011 to 2012 and contains Back to the Pilot, the episode in which Brian and Stewie travel to the first episode of the series and observe the original Griffins. Season 10, Stewie watches Season 1. Stewie, the fully committed evil genius baby with the ray guns and the world domination plans, and the theatrical certainty of purpose that later seasons progressively dismantled. The show plays his observation as amused. The theory reads the expression as more complicated as the expression of someone watching who they were before they understood what they were actually doing, watching the displacement behavior in its most active and most fully committed form. The theory this episode prompts extends backward across the show's entire history of Stewie's weapons and asks what those weapons actually are at the level below narrative function. Not what they do within the plots, but what they represent within the psychological architecture the show built around the character. The answer? Psychological projections. Physical forms that Stewie's interior life takes when it has no other available channel of expression. When the thing that needs to be said or addressed or felt cannot be approached directly, because approaching it directly would require an exposure, the person is not equipped to risk. The pressure converts itself into an external object or action that can be engaged with at a safer distance. The ray guns represent the need for power in an environment of absolute structural powerlessness. Stewie is 1 year old. He cannot reach the counter. He cannot open the refrigerator. He cannot make anyone attend to him through normal channels of communication because the people around him do not receive his communications at their actual register. The ray gun is the fantasy correction. I am not as helpless as I appear. I have something that should command your attention. Built by someone who needs to be taken seriously and has not yet received adequate evidence that the ordinary channels for earning that seriousness are available to him. The mind control devices represent the frustration of not being heard, not in the physical sense, but in the sense that matters more, the sense of being responded to at the level of the person rather than the surface. When Stewie speaks, the people around him manage the behavior without encountering the person producing it. The mind control device is the fantasy correction. If I can compel your response, I do not have to hope for it. Built by someone who has learned that hoping for reciprocity is unreliable and has decided to engineer an alternative. The time machine is the theory's most important piece, and the one that connects most directly to the grief that the dream theory proposes underlies the whole show. Time machines do not destroy and do not control people. They control time itself. They give their user the ability to return to the moment before the damage occurred, to undo what has been done, to restore what has been lost, to choose differently in the moment that became the before. This is the most specific fantasy available to someone living alongside irreversible loss. The idea that the past is still accessible, that loss can be reversed, that the moment before the bad thing happened still exists somewhere in the structure of things and can be returned to. Stewie builds a time machine in the nursery because some part of him needs to believe that the things that have already gone wrong can still be made right. This is the fantasy of prevention, of going back to the conversation that did not happen, the moment of connection that was not made, and making it happen this time. The time machine is not a weapon. It is a prayer. By season 10, the weapons appear much more rarely than they did in seasons 1 through 3. The show explains this as the writers choosing to move Stewie away from the evil baby persona. The theory adds, the weapons appear less urgently in season 10 because the need they were projecting has begun to be partially met. The Vault episode in season 8 changed the friendship with Brian in the specific way the previous section described. Having achieved genuine emotional contact with at least one person, having found someone who receives him at his actual level and stays present with what that level contains, the pressure behind the projections diminishes. They are still there. The time machine is still in the nursery, but it is not being maintained with the same urgency because the urgency has found somewhere else to go. Back to the Pilot is the episode where Stewie watches the projections in their original, fullest form. The commitment, the inventiveness, the enormous energy of someone who has put extraordinary effort into building the most elaborate possible answers to a question they have not yet been able to name. Season 1 Stewie was not failing at something. He was doing the most creative and energetic thing available to him with the resources he had. Season 10 Stewie, watching, knows this. And watching the expression the show plays as amused contains, underneath the amusement, something closer to recognition. Section 11. Season 11. The theory that the Griffin House is a place that will not release its inhabitants. Season 11 of Family Guy aired from September 2012 to May 2013. It contains the 200th episode of the series, Yug Yilimov, in which the time machine breaks and time begins reversing itself around Brian and Stewie, unmaking events, and moving Stewie progressively backward toward the moment before he existed. Brian must fix the machine before Stewie ceases to have been born. He does, arriving at the hospital at the precise moment of Stewie's birth, restoring the normal forward flow of time and events, returning everything to the state it was in before the malfunction. The season also contains Roads to Vegas, in which the time machine produces two duplicate versions of Brian and Stewie with opposite luck. The lucky pair attends the Bette Midler concert and wins at the casino. The unlucky pair is killed. Shot in Las Vegas by a loan shark's associate, dead in a way the show acknowledges and then moves past with the specific breezy indifference the later seasons developed for consequences that would, in any realistic narrative context, require sustained engagement. The deaths are noted, then they are irrelevant. The lucky pair is home at the end of the episode. Both of these episodes are the theory's primary evidence for the argument that the Griffin House is not simply a setting, but a structural feature of the story, a place that does not allow its inhabitants permanent departure, regardless of what narrative mechanics the show employs to suggest that departure might be possible. The theory reaches for the word purgatory with careful qualification. The Griffin House is not a place of punishment in the organized, purposive sense of theological purgatory designed to purify souls for a better destination. The characters in it are not being refined or moved progressively towards something more complete through their suffering. They are repeating. They cycle through the same emotional dynamics with the same people in the same house, with the same furniture, in slightly different surface configurations, episode after episode across 20-plus seasons. The repetition is not punishment. It is the structural feature of the place. It is what the place is for. What makes a place of repetition possible in narrative terms? The standard answer is that something unresolved keeps the characters in orbit, unable to achieve the forward momentum that would carry them out of the cycle. The unresolved thing in the Griffin House is the love that cannot find its way through the love that is present and real and consistent across every season, and that is expressed so inadequately, so noisily, so often through the wrong channels, that it produces damage at the point of contact rather than the connection it is aimed at. Peter loves his family in a way that the damage he does to them is the evidence of because the damage is done by someone who has lost the capacity to route the love correctly. He has the feeling and has lost the mechanism for converting it into expression that lands as what it is. Lois loves her family in a way that the management and control of her mothering sometimes obscures but does not eliminate. Brian loves the family in the specific way of someone whose love has nowhere else to go. Stewie loves Brian in the specific way of someone who has found the first real contact in a life previously organized around not needing any. These loves are real. They persist across every season. They are documented in the episodes, scattered throughout the middle and later runs of the show, where the characters drop the performance and the cartoon logic and say something true to each other. Those moments are rare. And after each one, the show resets, and the next episode proceeds as though the truth-saying did not quite happen, as though the love that was briefly visible has gone back behind the noise and the cruelty and the comedy. The Yug Yilimov episode is the theory's most direct dramatization of this dynamic. Time reverses, and the accumulated experience that made the characters who they are begins to unmake itself. Stewie moves backward toward non-existence. The show treats this as the thing most urgently worth preventing. And the theory asks, why? If the place is a cycle, if the accumulation produces only more repetition, why does the reversal of that accumulation feel catastrophic? The answer is the same answer the Griffin House gives in every episode, because the accumulation, even the painful accumulation, even the seasons of damage and missed connection and expressed love that consistently misses its target is what makes the place meaningful. Without it, you are simply in a house where people you do not know are making noise at each other. With it, you are in a place where people who love each other badly and need each other persistently and hurt each other repeatedly are still in every episode, in every season, across 20-plus years choosing to be in the same building, on the same street, under the same roof. The choosing matters. The staying matters, even when staying is expressed as the absence of leaving rather than as an active commitment to remain. And the house holds them because the thing that would let them leave the resolution of the love that cannot find its way through has not yet arrived, and the show's format will not allow it to arrive because arrival would be the end. The house on Spooner Street is the monument. As long as the lights are on inside it, the dream has not yet reached the thing it was built to postpone. Section 12, Season 12, and beyond. The theory that the show became aware of its own decline and chose honesty about it. Season 12 of Family Guy aired from 2013 to 2014, and it contains the most discussed single event in the show's history outside of its original cancellations and its revival. In November 2013, in the episode Life of Brian, Brian Griffin was killed, struck by a car outside the Griffin house, taken to the veterinarian, died. A new dog named Vinny was introduced as a replacement character. The event was treated with genuine dramatic weight, and the grief it produced in the audience was real. The story made national news. Social media responses trended for days. Fans who had watched the show for 15 years wrote about what the character had meant to them, about the specific form of attachment you develop for a fictional person across enough time, the way they become part of how you understand things, the way their absence feels like the loss of something that was never technically yours but was real to you in the ways that matter. And then, 2 episodes later, Stewie used a borrowed time travel device to prevent Brian from being hit by the car. Brian came back. Everything reset. The critical and fan response was largely unified. This was a ratings manipulation. The show deployed the audience's genuine love for the character to generate viewership across 2 episodes, knowing the death was not permanent, knowing the grief was real, and was being used for a commercial purpose. These criticisms were accurate. They identified a real thing that had been done. But the theory in this section is not primarily about the ethics of the death arc, which have been examined extensively elsewhere. It is about what the arc revealed about the show's relationship to its own self-knowledge and what the show chose to do with that self-knowledge in the 12-plus seasons that followed. What Life of Brian demonstrates the show knew? It knew, with precision, exactly how much the audience cared about Brian Griffin. It had spent 15 seasons building a character of sufficient depth and emotional resonance that his death would be genuinely felt. That knowledge was correct. The response confirmed it at a scale that made national headlines. And the show used that knowledge to make a specific commercial decision, to deploy the audience's genuine investment as a mechanism for short-term ratings, with no creative intention of honoring the deployment. This is a very particular kind of self-awareness, and it marks a specific transition point in the show's identity. Not because self-awareness is damaging in itself, but because this form of it, knowing exactly what your work means to people, and choosing to extract from that meaning rather than honor it, is the moment when a creative enterprise stops being organized around the question of what it can make and starts being organized around the question of what it can take. The broader pattern the later seasons establish is the transition from a show made by people who were genuinely engaged with what they were building to a show managed by people who understood what they had and chose to treat it as an asset to be sustained rather than a project to be developed. This transition did not happen at once. Seth MacFarlane stepped back from active creative involvement around 2011, with showrunning duties going to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin. The original writing staff that had built the show's voice across the first 3 seasons had largely dispersed. The production demands of generating 20-plus episodes per season created pressures that rewarded the most easily reproducible elements of the show's formula, which is to say, the cutaway gags at the expense of the character work and the narrative structure that had made those elements feel like additions to something rather than replacements for it. The self-referential humor that became increasingly prominent from approximately season 10 onward is the show acknowledging this transition without being able to address it. Characters breaking the fourth wall to observe that the show has been on too long. Episodes explicitly built around deconstructing the cutaway gag format. Peter making jokes to the audience about what they are watching. These are not the moves of genuine humility. There is a meaningful difference between real self-awareness, which is the recognition of a problem as the first step toward changing it, and performed self-awareness, which is the recognition of a problem deployed as a substitute for changing it. The latter is, in some ways, more corrosive than simple ignorance, because it eliminates the honest response available to the audience. You cannot criticize the show for its quality when the show has already made the joke. The acknowledgement preempts the reckoning. The joke becomes the inoculation. Seth MacFarlane's 2024 interview, in which he discussed the show's continuation, is the theory's most direct external evidence. He described the show as having reached escape velocity. He framed its continuation in terms of financial utility, the ability to fund causes he cared about, specifically environmental conservation through organizations like Rainforest Trust. He acknowledged there had been a period when he thought ending the show was the right choice. He did not describe creative excitement about new stories. He did not describe directions he was eager to explore or characters he wanted to develop. He described a machine that was still running because the economics had not yet stopped supporting its operation. This is an honest description. It deserves to be received as such. Seth MacFarlane created something that was, in its golden years, one of the sharpest and most original animated comedies on American television. He maintained it with genuine passion and attention during the period when he was most directly involved. He stepped back when other opportunities legitimately demanded his attention and energy, and he is describing the result of that step back with the directness of someone who is not interested in maintaining fictions about artistic purpose he no longer fully feels. The honesty itself is admirable. It is also, as the theory argues, the most complete confirmation that the show's later seasons are best understood not as failed attempts at the quality the early seasons achieved, but as the honest expression of what a show looks like when it exists, primarily for reasons that are not creative. The theories across this video work find real material, generate real readings, because the early seasons were made with the specific attention that only genuine caring produces. When the caring departed from the center of the enterprise, what remained was professional, competent, periodically funny, and organized around extraction rather than creation. The April 2025 renewal announcement, extending Family Guy through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, guaranteeing a run to the show's 30th anniversary, is the final piece of this picture. The show that premiered to 22 million viewers in 1999 was drawing fewer than 1 million viewers in its most recent seasons before that renewal. The audience had spoken in the most direct way available, by leaving. The show was renewed anyway, because the economics of animated television, the low production costs, the vast value in streaming rights, reruns, licensing, merchandise meant that a small live audience was commercially sufficient. The show persists because it is financially viable, not because it is artistically necessary. The distance between those two things is the distance between what Family Guy was at its best and what it eventually became. And yet, the theories in this video, 12 of them, one for every season from the pilot through the point where the show became self-aware about what it was, are not claims about authorial intent. They are not arguments that any specific writer consciously planned the dream theory or deliberately encoded a portrait of long-term depression in Brian's arc, or intentionally built a purgatorial metaphysics into the house on Spooner Street. They are something different. The demonstration that stories mean more than what they intend to mean, that characters built with genuine care accumulate resonance that extends beyond the choices any individual writer made on any specific week, and that paying close attention to a piece of culture across enough time sometimes reveals a structure deeper than the one anyone consciously built. The house on Spooner Street was built around grief, whether or not anyone building it knew that. The baby in the yellow shirt constructed weapons that were always really questions. The dog in the good chair managed something quietly for years before he said it plainly. The daughter who could not forget anything stood in a hurricane and told the truth, and was asked to take it back so everyone else could keep forgetting. The father, whose mind was slowly going, kept coming home because the dream would not let him do anything else. These people are still in the house. The dream is still running. The simulation has not terminated. Whatever the show became in the decades after its golden years, whatever ground it ceded, whatever quality it traded away, whatever distance grew between the machine and the passion that originally built it, it cannot undo what it was. The early seasons are still there in the specific hand-drawn animation of 1999 and 2000 and 2001, with the character voices still finding themselves, with the stories that ended with people who loved each other trying imperfectly to say so. The Vault episode is still there. The Season 3 Stewie building something in his crib and waiting to be seen is still there. These things exist. They were made by people who cared. They are what the theories find in finding them, understanding why they are there, understanding the specific architecture of love and loss and imperfect expression that built them, is what makes the paying of close attention to something worth doing. The show was one of the most beloved animated comedies ever made. It changed what television was willing to do. It came back from cancellation not once but twice because enough people loved it enough to bring it back, which almost never happens. And in the end, it became what it became, a machine that outlived its passion and chose to run on something else because the something else was available and sufficient, and the door to stopping was more complicated than the door to continuing. There is something honest in that, something real, something that resembles, in its own way, the very thing the theories have been describing across 12 sections, the persistence of a thing past the point where it was most fully itself, the continuing forward motion of a love that has lost some of its most essential qualities and continues anyway, for reasons that are complicated and impure, and still, in the end, real. The family comes home. Every week, across every season. Whatever the quality of the episode, whatever state the characters are in, the family comes home, the lights are on in the yellow house, and somewhere in the nursery, a baby who wanted more than anything to be known by the people around him is still building something and still waiting. That is enough to close the light on. That is enough to fall asleep beside. If you made it here, thank you. Genuinely, these take a long time to put together, and they go to places that require a particular kind of quiet to enter, and the fact that you stayed for all of it means something. Like the video if it found you well. Subscribe if you want more of this. It is the single most useful thing you can do for the channel. It costs you nothing, and it is how content like this finds the people who want it. We will find each other again in the next one. Expanded Section 1, Additional Depth. The Dream Architecture of Season 1. The dream theory becomes richer the more carefully you examine the specific episodes of Season 1 rather than treating them as a collective backdrop. Each installment, taken individually, adds another layer to the framework, another piece of evidence that the world being depicted is organized by an intelligence that needs specific things from the story, rather than by writers simply generating comedy from a dysfunctional family premise. Take the episode I Never Met the Dead Man, the second episode to air, which follows the pilot immediately. Peter causes a car accident that destroys the town's television antennas, resulting in a complete blackout of broadcast television across Quahog. The family is forced to exist without TV for the duration of the episode, and the results range from creative to chaotic. But the specific detail the theory notices is this. In the dream reading, television is the medium through which the dreamer is processing the fantasy itself. It is the frame within the frame. When television disappears from the world of the dream briefly loses its own organizing medium, its own way of making the fantasy coherent and navigable. The episode's chaos is not just the Griffin family struggling without entertainment. It is the dream briefly losing its own structural scaffolding and having to find another way to hold itself together. The episode Chitty Chitty Death Bang, the third of the series, involves Stewie's attempts to summon a cult figure he has made a previous appointment with a character who, in the episode's framing, represents some kind of dark cosmic authority Stewie has arranged to meet. The episode plays this as dark, absurdist comedy, and it functions perfectly well on those terms. But in the dream reading, the figure Stewie is trying to summon is the dreamer's own relationship with the irreversible, with the permanent thing that happened that the dream was built to hold at bay. Stewie's arrangement with this figure, and his attempts to either postpone or renegotiate it, are the dream's internal negotiation with mortality itself. The dream knows what it is protecting against. And in the third episode, it staged a small drama about whether the terms of that protection can be modified. These readings are not claims that the writers intended them. They are demonstrations of how richly the early material rewards close attention, how the specific choices made in those first episodes, choices that look like simple comedy premises, carry meanings that resonate differently when the whole of the show is held in mind. The dream theory earns its credibility not because any single piece of evidence is conclusive, but because the accumulation of small details forms a pattern that is too consistent to be entirely accidental. The theory's deepest implication for Season 1 is about genre. Family Guy in its first season is typically categorized as a dysfunctional family comedy with anarchic sensibility. The dream theory proposes a different genre. It is a grief narrative staged as comedy. The comedy is the coping mechanism. The family is the thing being preserved. The chaos is the price of keeping everything moving, keeping the dream active enough that it does not go quiet long enough for the underlying truth to surface. You cannot let a dream get too still, or it starts to become something else. You cannot let the jokes stop. The jokes are the maintenance work. The chaos is the machinery of survival. When you watch Season 1 with this in mind, the specific quality of Peter's energy takes on a different cast. He is not simply a lovable idiot generating problems and then resolving them. He is a dreamer keeping himself busy, keeping the dream populated and active and loud. Every catastrophically bad decision Peter makes is another installment of the dream's most essential feature, the proof that things keep happening, that the family is still alive enough to be in trouble, that the story is still going. The story stopping the silence, the stillness is the thing the dreamer cannot afford. The pilot ends with Peter dumping the welfare money from a blimp over the Super Bowl, getting arrested, and being freed by Stewie's mind control device before a judge who finds no reason to hold him. The judge who finds no reason. In any realistic story, Peter would face real consequences. In this story, the authority figure looks at the evidence and decides it does not add up to anything permanent. The dream's organizing intelligence, the dreamer's will, has ensured that the consequence falls short of the permanent, has ensured that the family comes home. This is not a flaw. This is the whole point. Expanded Section 2 Additional Depth. The Inheritance of Abandonment. Brian's story in Season 2 sets up a dynamic that the show returns to repeatedly across its entire run without ever quite being willing to name it directly. The way the experience of early abandonment shapes every subsequent relationship a person attempts to form. The theory does not simply claim that Brian is depressed because he drinks too much. It claims that Brian drinks too much because he is depressed, and that the depression has a specific origin that the show knows about and keeps gesturing toward without ever allowing to be fully processed. The mother who left, the stray who was found, the dog who was given a home contingent on being useful. These are the foundational facts of Brian's situation, and they produce a very specific psychological profile. Someone whose baseline assumption about human relationships is that they are conditional on continued performance, that warmth can be withdrawn without warning, that the security he appears to have is provisional in ways that the people around him may not fully understand. This assumption shapes everything Brian does. The relationships that move too fast because he needs to test whether this person will leave before he lets himself believe they will stay. The novel that never gets finished because finishing it would mean submitting it to a verdict, and the verdict, if negative, would confirm what the deepest part of him already believes about his own worth. The drinking that continues because the drinking reduces the acuity of the fear without eliminating the fear, and eliminating the fear would require a kind of sustained safety that nothing in his history has taught him to trust. Season 2 is where all of this is introduced in sufficient detail that the theory can begin to trace its consequences forward. The therapy episode, the moment in Brian in Love where the therapist gently suggests that the behavior Brian has been experiencing might be connected to feelings he has not been examining directly. The way Brian deflects from that suggestion, not with hostility but with humor, because humor has always been the more socially acceptable form of deflection available to someone who is intelligent enough to know what he is being asked to look at, and to understand why looking at it directly would be painful. The irony of Brian's situation, and the show was always aware of irony when it was at its best, is that the intelligence that makes his loneliness so specific is also the thing that makes it so hard to address. He is smart enough to understand his own patterns, smart enough to see the mechanism driving the failing relationships and the unfinished novel and the drinking. Understanding the mechanism and being able to interrupt it are not the same thing, and the gap between them is one of the most precisely described features of the condition the theory is tracking. You can see the pattern clearly and continue performing it anyway, because the pattern developed before you were capable of choosing differently, and it has had decades to become structural. Season 2 is the season where this gap opens, where the character is close enough to his own self-awareness to occasionally touch it, the therapy episode, the conversations with Peter that come close to something real before veering back into comedy but not close enough to act on it in any sustained way. The gap is small in Season 2. By the Vault episode in Season 8, the gap has widened into something that is visible from a significant distance and that the episode names quietly in a bank vault at a late hour with nobody watching but Stewie. Expanded Section 3 Additional Depth. The Failure as Evidence. The theory about Stewie's matricide project becomes more compelling the more specifically you examine the individual failures across Season 3. Each one has a texture that distinguishes it from simple narrative convenience, from the show simply needing Lois to remain alive for ongoing plot purposes. The failures have an emotional logic that the theory maps as follows. In the episodes where Stewie gets closest to execution, the specific intervention that derails him is always something Lois does that is not defensive or strategic. She does not outmaneuver him. She does not recognize the threat and neutralize it. She does something warm. Something that is addressed to Stewie as the specific person he is, rather than as a managed developmental responsibility. And the warmth, rather than the strategic failure, is what undoes the plan. This is the key distinction. A person who genuinely wants to kill someone and is thwarted fails because of external obstacles. The plan was good, but something went wrong. The target was clever. The equipment malfunctioned. The window closed. These are failures of execution. What Stewie experiences across Season 3 is not failures of execution. He fails because he stops. He reaches the threshold, and the threshold is crossed not by Lois doing something defensive, but by Lois doing something that gives him, briefly, what the weapons were built to ask for. And in that moment, the moment of receiving the thing the weapons were built to ask for, the weapons become unnecessary. The urgency that drove them evaporates. The plan dissolves not because it was stopped, but because the need behind it was momentarily met. This is a very specific failure mode. It is the failure mode of the displacement behavior when the underlying need is accidentally addressed through a channel the displacing person did not anticipate. The baby with the ray gun does not want to fire the ray gun. The baby wants to be held by the person he built the ray gun to destroy. When the holding happens, when Lois picks him up with genuine, specific, unperformed warmth, the ray gun is revealed for what it always was, a question that was answered, temporarily, through the wrong means. Season 3 is the last season where the show committed to this dynamic with full consistency. After the revival, the dynamic fragmented, partly by design and partly because the writing rooms that produced the later seasons did not always have full access to what had been built in the early ones. But in Season 3, the pattern is complete and coherent. And once you see it, it does not leave you. Every scene with Stewie and Lois in those early episodes becomes something more than comedy about an evil baby. It becomes the story of a person trying to say, "I am here," in the loudest possible language available to him, and the story of someone else who almost hears him, almost sees him, almost reaches him. Expanded Section 4 Additional Depth. The Anatomy of the Change. The petarded episode did not change Peter overnight. The theory is careful about this. What it did was establish, within the show's internal logic, a formal cognitive status that functioned as a permission structure, a background justification that could be invoked, consciously or not, every time the writing room wanted to push Peter's behavior further than the character's original construction would have supported. The process by which the change occurred across seasons 5 through 10 is worth examining in its specific stages, because the specificity is what makes the theory more than a general complaint about character decline. Season 5, Peter is still recognizable as the character from the early seasons. He does things that are cruel or thoughtless, but the cruelty is still mostly in the register of impulsive stupidity rather than directed malice. He causes harm through the absence of adequate reflection rather than through the presence of active ill will toward the people he harms. The early Season 5 episodes could, if you squinted, still be read as the adventures of a person who means well and keeps failing to mean well effectively. The mean-spiritedness is present, but it is not yet the dominant note. By Season 7, it is the dominant note. The specific quality of Peter's humor has shifted from the comedy of a person who cannot quite manage their own consequences to the comedy of a person who appears to enjoy the consequences on some level, or at least who is entirely indifferent to them, which, in terms of its effect on the people around him, is practically equivalent to enjoyment. The laugh that greets Meg's confrontation in Season 10 is the destination this shift was always heading toward. Not the product of a single decision, but the accumulated product of hundreds of small decisions made over several seasons, each one pushing the character slightly further in the direction that the petarded diagnosis had made theoretically available. What was lost in this process, the theory argues, was not Peter's likability in the superficial sense. Some fans continued to find the later Peter funny, in the way that chaos and bad behavior can be funny in a context where you are not required to care about the victims. What was lost was the heart, the specific combination of genuine love and catastrophic incompetence that made the early character a kind of comedy archetype, the good person who is terrible at being good. Without the genuine love, the catastrophic incompetence is just catastrophic. Without the heart, the chaos is not funny in the same way because there is no longer any warmth underneath it to give the chaos meaning or resolution. The show knew this, at some level. The fourth-wall-breaking jokes about Peter's character in the later seasons, the episodes that explicitly acknowledge the character has become harder to root for, are the show's internal acknowledgement that the heart is gone. But acknowledging its absence is not the same as restoring it. The later seasons acknowledged and moved on. The petarded door stayed open. The permission structure remained in place. The character kept going in the direction the diagnosis had made available. Expanded Section 5 Additional Depth. The cost of the volunteer. The theory about Quagmire's unspoken moral framework gains additional texture when you examine not just what the framework produces the patience in the face of Peter's behavior, the measured response to the airplane sabotage, but what it costs. Because the theory is not arguing that Quagmire's position is without cost. It is arguing that the cost is real, that Quagmire knows the cost is real, and that the alternate timeline in the Season 5 finale is the single most direct evidence the show provides that he carries the knowledge of what he gave up to occupy the role he occupies. The alternate timeline Quagmire is content. This is the word the theory keeps returning to, not happy in the performed, surface sense, but content in the specific sense of someone whose daily experience is organized around things that fit who they are. Domestic, settled, present in his own life rather than performing a persona for the social benefit of others. This Quagmire is recognizable as the same person, the voice is the same, the mannerisms are the same, but something that in the main timeline is always running underneath the surface of his behavior has come to the surface here and made him look, in the alternate timeline's few minutes of screen time, more fully himself than he typically appears. And then, the timeline is restored. The window closes. Main timeline Quagmire snaps back into place, back into the persona, back into the role. The show does not acknowledge what just happened. It does not give Quagmire a moment of grief for the alternate version of his life. It simply continues, which is perhaps the most honest possible treatment. The sacrifice was made long ago and has been made continuously since, and by this point it is not experienced as acute loss, but as the baseline condition of the life he has chosen. What Quagmire sacrifices, specifically, is the possibility of being known as the person he is in the alternate timeline, rather than as the persona he maintains in the main one. The persona is the most visible part of him to everyone in the show's world, including the audience. The person underneath the Navy-trained, genuinely competent, specifically capable man who looked at a different possible life and chose not to live it in service of a role his social world required. Someone to fill is visible only in the moments where the persona slips slightly, and in the single episode where the alternate timeline makes him legible in full. The theory's final word on Quagmire is this: he is the show's most consistently misread character. He is read as the punchline. He is the punchline for the audience and for most of the other characters in the show. But the theory reads him as the person who is most deliberately, most carefully, most consciously present in the narrative, the one who made a choice with full understanding of what the choice cost, and has been maintaining that choice across every season, without complaint and without the expectation of credit. The alternate timeline gave him nothing that changed the main one. He came back and continued. And the continuing is, in the theory's reading, the most specific and the most under-acknowledged form of courage the show depicts. Expanded Section 6 Additional Depth. What the sentence would have said. The simulation theory hangs, in its most evocative form, on the incomplete sentence, the word that gets cut off mid-pronunciation as the Season 6 two-parter ends and the show goes to black. The Sopranos reference makes it funny. The theory makes it structural. The sentence is still being spoken somewhere, in the dark, past the cut. What would the sentence have said? The theory does not pretend to know this is not that kind of theory, not the kind that resolves into a single answer. But it engages with the question as a way of examining what the simulation was ultimately designed to discover. The simulation was, in Stewie's framing, a probability assessment. He ran the scenario to learn what would actually happen if he followed through on his stated goal, not because he expected the result to be good, but because he needed the information the result would provide. The information, as the two-parter demonstrated, was, following through on the stated goal produces bad outcomes for Stewie personally, not because the world resists him, but because the world he destroys is the world he lives in. Killing the target means destroying the container of the life. And whatever Stewie's specific reasons for wanting to destroy the container, the simulation demonstrated that he did not actually want to live without it. That is the information the simulation produced. And the sentence that was cut off mid-word, the sentence Stewie was speaking as the show went to black, the sentence that never finished might have been the sentence in which Stewie said something about what he was going to do with that information. Something about the fact that the goal he had maintained for 3 seasons was a goal that, when pursued to its logical conclusion, terminated the thing he needed most. Something about what it means to discover that the enemy and the home are the same place. Something about Lois, finally, as the person the weapons were always really addressed to rather than aimed at. The sentence is unfinished. The simulation is still running. The later seasons are the continuation of the thinking that could not be completed in the moment, the ongoing working out of what the simulation taught, in a context that is itself a continuation of the simulated space. Stewie sits in the chair. The screen continues generating scenarios. The show continues generating episodes. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the sentence keeps being spoken, one season at a time, working toward a conclusion that the show's format may never allow it to reach, but that the characters are still, in their various ways, moving toward. Expanded Section 7 Additional Depth, The Geography of Departure. Cleveland's departure from Family Guy is made more legible by thinking carefully about the specific geography of the show, the way the physical spaces of Quahog function as extensions of the character dynamics that occupy them. The Drunken Clam is the group's primary space. It is where the friendships are maintained, where the dynamics play out, where the specific combination of characters that makes the show's social world cohere comes together on a regular basis. And the Drunken Clam, across the seasons, becomes increasingly defined by Peter's energy, rather than being a space that balances multiple energies against each other. In the early seasons, the bar felt like a place that belonged to all four of the regulars. Peter, and Cleveland, and Quagmire and Joe each occupied a distinct portion of the room's energy, and the room felt larger for their combined presence. As the seasons progressed, the bar increasingly felt like Peter's bar that the others happened to occupy. The balance had shifted. For Cleveland, who had always been the group's balancing presence, the shift in the bar's energy dynamic was the spatial expression of the larger problem the theory has been describing. The place where the group's stability was maintained had become the place where the group's instability was centered. Going to the Drunken Clam no longer meant entering a space where his particular contribution was valued and effective. It meant entering a space where his contribution was being slowly made irrelevant by the escalating centrality of the very thing it was designed to counterbalance. The house on Spooner Street presents its own geography in this reading. Cleveland's house is next door adjacent to the chaos, close enough that the boundary between them is permeable, separated by only a yard and a driveway. And across multiple seasons, Cleveland's house was repeatedly invaded by the chaos next door. The most dramatic instance, the running gag of Cleveland's bathtub crashing through the floor of his house into the yard, driven by some external disturbance functions, in the theory's reading, as the physical manifestation of what was happening to Cleveland's emotional space. The thing he built as his own was being regularly broken into by the force of the thing next to it. The Cleveland Show, in which Cleveland moves to a different state entirely, is the most literal possible version of the solution the theory describes. He did not just move to a different neighborhood. He moved to a different region of the country. He put the maximum possible physical distance between himself and the geography that had been consistently, repeatedly invading his own space. And the show about his new life in Stoolbend is the show about what happens when the person whose boundaries were constantly penetrated finally establishes boundaries that are respected, or at least tested less relentlessly. His return to Quahog in Season 12 is the return to the geography. Back to Spooner Street, back next to the Yellow House, back in the proximity of the Drunken Clam and everything the Drunken Clam had become. He chose to return to it knowing what he was choosing. The geography had not changed. But Cleveland had the comparison point now, the knowledge of the alternative, and he came back anyway because the history embedded in that geography was real in ways that made it worth the cost of re-entering. Expanded Section 8 Additional Depth. What the Vault Contains. The Vault episode earns additional resonance when you place it within the broader architecture of what Brian had been building across 8 seasons, not consciously, not deliberately, but through the accumulation of small choices that had steadily narrowed the options available to him. Each decision Brian made in the years between Season 1 and Season 8 that moved him further from the honest engagement with his own interior life and further into the performance of someone who has their life under control was a brick in a wall being built between his stated self and his actual self. The political speeches that performed conviction rather than expressing it, the novel that was discussed as an ongoing project rather than as a finished thing, because discussing it as ongoing preserved the identity of being a writer without requiring the exposure of submitting the writing to judgment. The relationships that moved fast and crashed, following the predictable mechanics of someone whose attachment system was organized around the anxiety of potential loss rather than the security of established trust. Each of these was a brick. The wall was not built all at once. It was built the way most such walls are built, one small decision at a time, over years, until one day the wall is large enough that the person behind it is living in a kind of enclosure they did not entirely choose but can no longer see over. The vault is not metaphorical. The vault is the physical instantiation of what the wall looks like when it is externalized into an actual object that exists in an actual space. Brian did not build the wall, he built a vault. He did not construct an interior prison. He placed an object in a bank and rented a box in which to keep it. The genius of the episode's construction is that the vault is the most honest piece of Brian's spatial world. More honest than the Griffin House, more honest than the Drunken Clam, more honest than any of the spaces in which Brian performs the version of himself that the other characters and the audience have come to know. In the bank vault, with only Stewie present and nowhere to go and nothing to perform for, what has been hidden in the safety deposit box comes out. And Stewie's response is the episode's other structural masterwork. He does not use his intelligence to analyze what Brian has told him. He does not offer a solution or a plan or a lecture. He says the thing that the theory has argued he was always trying to say, has been trying to say since the first season, through the weapons and the schemes and the theatrical commitment to the displacement behavior. He says, "I see you. You are real to me. If you are not here, something irreplaceable would be gone from my world." This is the thing the baby in the nursery built all the weapons to ask for. He got it in a bank vault in season 8 from the one person in the show who understood what he was actually asking, because Brian, despite everything, despite the wall and the vault and the years of building, both had never stopped being the one character in the household who paid attention to Stewie as an actual person, rather than as a developmental stage to be managed. The vault episode is the show's truest moment, because it is the moment where both of the primary theories in this analysis, the theory about Brian and the theory about Stewie, arrive at their point of contact. The person who had been managing a quiet and enormous loneliness disclosed it to the person who had been asking, through the loudest possible channels, to be seen. And in the vault, in the dark, they found each other in the specific way that two people who have been telling different versions of the same story find each other when they finally say it plainly. Expanded Section 9 Additional Depth. The accumulation and its cost. The specific texture of Meg's accumulation across the 9 seasons that precede the Seahorse Seashell Party confrontation is worth examining at the level of individual episodes and individual moments, because what makes her characterization unusual is not simply that she is mistreated, but the specific way in which the mistreatment accumulates and the specific changes it produces in her over time. In Season 1, Meg's default mode is aspiration. She wants to be included, to be seen as interesting, to be treated as relevant by the family and by her peers. The wanting is active and visible. She tries things. She makes attempts. She puts herself in positions of potential rejection with some regularity because the possibility of acceptance is still present enough to be worth risking the rejection. She has not yet been taught, by sufficient repetition, that the risk reliably produces the same outcome. By season 5 or 6, the active aspiration has been replaced by something quieter and more defended. She still wants the same things: inclusion, relevance, genuine connection with the family, but the wanting has gone underground. The active attempts become less frequent. The positions of potential rejection become less readily occupied. The specific mechanism here is the one that repeated experience of rejection reliably produces: the gradual recalibration of the cost-benefit analysis, in which the cost of attempting is increasingly weighted against a probability of success that experience has been consistently lowering. By this point in the show, Meg has enough data about the likely outcomes of making herself visible that making herself visible is less frequently worth the cost. By seasons 8 through 10, what the early seasons depicted as aspiration has been almost entirely replaced by what the theory identifies as adaptive resignation, the specific, functional form of giving up that allows a person to continue operating within a situation they cannot change. By reducing their attachment to the outcomes, the situation consistently fails to provide. She does not stop wanting the same things, she stops expecting them. The wanting has been decoupled from the expecting, and the decoupling is what makes the want sustainable. You can want things indefinitely if you have stopped requiring them. The seahorse-seashell party confrontation is the moment when the adaptive resignation cracks. Something in the specific accumulation of that evening breaks through the defended layer and the original aspiration the Season 1 Meg, who was still making active attempts, who had not yet learned to protect herself from the consistent results of making active attempts, surfaces in the confrontation and speaks from that place. The testimony she delivers is not cynical. It is not resigned. It is the speech of someone who still cares enough, still wants enough, still has enough of the original aspiration intact underneath the years of adaptive resignation, to say clearly and specifically what the wanting has cost and what the situation has actually been. And then it is taken back. The crack is sealed. The adaptive resignation reasserts. The theory reads this not as weakness, but as the specific, functional survival response that 8 seasons of the situation Meg has been living in would predictably produce. She cannot afford to sustain the crack. The crack requires that the family be capable of changing in response to what she said. They are not. The format will not allow it. The crack is a luxury she cannot afford in a situation where the only sustainable response is the one she already had. This is the show's most honest portrayal of the cost of living in a system that will not change. The eventual, grinding, functional acceptance of the system's terms, not because the acceptance is right, but because the alternative is more expensive than the resources available can sustain. Meg at the end of Seahorse-Seashell Party is not giving up. She is making the only rational choice available to her within the constraints the show has built around her character. And the fact that those constraints are real, that the show's format genuinely prevents any other outcome, is what makes the moment so specifically, precisely uncomfortable to watch. Expanded Section 10 Additional Depth. The Prayer in the Machine. The time machine, as the Season 10 theory established, is the most important object in the show's universe. Not because of what it can do in plot terms, though it does a great deal in plot terms across many seasons, but because of what it represents in the psychological architecture the theory has been building. It is the externalized form of the deepest need the dream theory identified in the show's underlying structure. The need to go back to before the loss and try again. The show uses the time machine in increasingly interesting ways as the seasons progress. In the early seasons, it is primarily a plot device for Stewie's schemes, a tool for executing the world domination and matricide plans that constitute his stated agenda. By the middle seasons, as the scheme-focused version of Stewie gives way to the more emotionally available version, the time machine is used differently. For the Brian and Stewie road adventures, for philosophical explorations of what-ifs and alternate paths, for the specific kind of storytelling that asks what would have happened if things had been different. And then, in Season 12, the time machine is used for the single most emotionally significant purpose it serves across the entire run. Stewie uses it to save Brian. Not to achieve a goal, not to execute a plan, not to test a scenario or explore a possibility. To keep someone he loves from being lost. This is the time machine being used for the purpose it was always, in the theory's reading, built for. Not to go back and change the past because the past was wrong. To go back and prevent a specific, particular, irreplaceable loss. To make the thing that happened not have happened. To restore the before. The Season 12 Christmas Guy episode in which this occurs is the moment where the time machine's psychological meaning is most completely fulfilled. Stewie does not have the time machine in that episode. He destroyed it in the previous episode, precisely because he was tired of the close calls and the alterations of history and the weight of being the person responsible for the machine's consequences. And then Brian is killed. And Stewie, without the machine, cannot fix it. He tries to rebuild it and cannot get the parts in time. He runs out of time. He is watching the clock count down toward the moment when the loss becomes permanent, and he cannot stop it. And then he sees himself, his past self, from an earlier point in time, carrying the machine's return pad. And he makes the choice to take the pad from his past self and use it to go back and prevent the accident. This choice costs him something. His past self will return to an earlier time without the pad and will experience a version of reality that is fractured by the absence of a crucial component. It is a sacrifice in the specific sense of accepting a cost to yourself in order to prevent a loss to someone you love. This is the time machine as prayer. Not the prayer that goes upward toward something abstract and cosmic. The prayer that goes backward in time toward a moment that can still be changed, addressed to the architecture of causality itself. Please let me not arrive too late. Please let the moment still be accessible. Please let the before still exist. The theory argues that this moment, Stewie running through a shopping mall with a borrowed return pad, racing against the clock, is the culmination of everything the time machine was always built to do. Not the world domination, not the schemes, not even the philosophical adventures across alternate timelines. This, the prevention of a specific, irreplaceable loss. The keeping here of the one person who sees him. Expanded section, 11 additional depth, the arithmetic of love. The purgatory theory gains its final dimension when you examine not the repetition itself, but the specific emotional content that repeats the specific form of love that the Griffin House cycles through, episode after episode, season after season, without ever quite arriving at its destination. The love in the Griffin House has a particular and specific quality. It is always real, it is always present, and it is almost always expressed in ways that produce damage at the point of contact. This is not coincidental. The theory proposes that this is the specific form of love that the dream required, the form of love that could be depicted without resolution, that could be shown again and again without ever exhausting itself, that could produce endless new variations on the same fundamental dynamic without ever reaching the conclusion that would end the dream's need to continue. If the love in the Griffin House were expressed effectively, if Peter managed to translate his genuine care for his family into actions and words that landed as genuine care, the story would end. There would be nothing left to generate. The family would be fine. The dream would have arrived at the thing it was protecting against arriving at, which is the moment where the loss is no longer held at bay by the activity of the love, but acknowledged directly as the real thing underneath all the noise. The love has to be expressed badly, has to be routed through channels that damage rather than connect, has to produce cruelty where it aims at warmth and silence where it aims at communication. Not because the love is not real, it is real. The theory insists on this at every point, but because the dream needs it to remain unresolved. An unresolved love is an active love, a love that keeps generating new episodes, new attempts, new catastrophic expressions of the same underlying warmth that cannot find its way through to the people it is aimed at. Every episode of Family Guy, in this reading, is another attempt. Peter does something that is an expression of his love for his family, routed catastrophically through his complete absence of judgment and his progressive erosion of empathy, and the result is damage. The next week, the love is still there, still looking for an exit, still attempting the same basic project through the available means. The love does not give up because the dreamer cannot afford for it to give up. The love persisting, however badly expressed, however consistently damaging at the point of contact, is the proof that the family is still alive, that they are still worth loving, that the dream is still holding. This is the arithmetic of the house on Spooner Street, an enormous and genuine love divided by a complete inability to express it effectively, generating an infinite series of attempts that never reach their destination but that never stop being made. The sum is not zero. The sum is the show itself, 20+ years of attempts, each one failing in a new way, each failure generating the next attempt, the whole accumulation held together by the single, unviolated rule that no matter what happens, the family comes home. Expanded section, 12 additional depth. What the early seasons knew. The final dimension of the theory about the show's later self-awareness is the comparison it makes to the early seasons, the question of what the early seasons knew that the later ones did not, or could not, or chose not to use. The early seasons knew, in the specific way that things are known when they are being actively used rather than remembered, that a comedy about a dysfunctional family works only as long as the family is recognizably connected by love. Not by functional love, not by well-expressed love, not by love that produces good outcomes or makes sensible choices, but by love that is unmistakably present, that can be felt underneath all the noise and the chaos and the cartoon logic. That gives the chaos meaning by making it clear that something worth protecting is being protected badly by people who would be lost without it. The specific early episodes that most clearly demonstrate this knowledge are the ones that end with the family in a state of genuine, if imperfect, repair. Peter does something catastrophic, and Lois is hurt. And there is a moment, usually brief, usually imperfectly executed, but real, a moment where Peter knows he was wrong, where the knowledge lands on him, where he tries in his specific, catastrophically incompetent way to make it right. And the making right is accepted because Lois can see, even through the catastrophic incompetence, that the love underneath the damage is genuine. The repair is not the resolution of the underlying problem, but it is the evidence that the underlying love is real enough to keep trying. This specific dynamic catastrophic expression, damage, recognition, imperfect repair, continuation, is the emotional engine of the early seasons. It is what makes the show feel warm even when it is being cruel. It is what allows the audience to maintain affection for characters who are objectively terrible at being the people they want to be. The warmth is not incidental. It is not a secondary feature. It is the load-bearing structure. Remove it and the cruelty becomes simply cruelty. The chaos becomes simply noise. And the show becomes what its critics have argued the later seasons became, a production that generates output without meaning it. The later seasons removed it gradually and incompletely. There were always episodes scattered through the middle and later seasons where the warmth was briefly recoverable, where the load-bearing structure was briefly visible again beneath the weight of everything piled on top of it. The Vault episode, the Christmas Guy episode, the specific scattered moments when a character said something true to another character and the show did not immediately undercut it with a joke or reset it with a cutaway. These moments proved that the structure was still there, still present in the material, still capable of bearing weight when the writing room chose to use it. The show knew what it had. The self-referential jokes in the later seasons are evidence that it knew. The fourth wall breaks, the meta-commentary on the cutaway format, the characters who looked directly at the audience and acknowledged the quality of what they were watching. All of this is the show saying, in its own specific and self-deprecating way, we know what this was. We know what it stopped being. We are making jokes about the knowing because the knowing is real and we cannot do anything else with it at this point except make jokes. The early seasons did not need to make those jokes because the early seasons were still doing the thing. The load-bearing structure was bearing the load. The love was doing what the love was supposed to do, imperfectly and noisily and through channels that produced as much damage as connection, but doing it. The show was not explaining what it was. It was being what it was. That distinction between doing and explaining, between being and describing, is the final thing the theory offers. The early Family Guy was doing something. It was building a world, maintaining a dream, keeping a family alive in the specific way that matters to the specific person who built the dream to keep them alive. The later Family Guy was explaining what the early seasons had done, commenting on it, making jokes about having done it and about having stopped doing it so completely. The distance between those two activities is enormous. It is the distance between a house that is a home and a monument to what the home was. The lights are still on, the family still comes home. The yellow house is still on Spooner Street in Quahog, Rhode Island, the most fictional town in the most carefully constructed dream that 22 years of American television produced. And somewhere inside it, the dream's organizing intelligence, the grief that built the world, and the love that kept it running, is still doing the only thing it was ever designed to do. Holding. Just holding. Against everything. For as long as the dream can last. Thank you for spending this time here. These videos take a long time to build, and they go to places that require a particular kind of patience to enter, and the fact that you stayed for all of it, whatever time it is, wherever in the world you are, means something real. Like the video if it was worth the time. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of slow, careful, story-shaped content. We will find each other in the next one. Deeper dive, the dream theory, and the show's cancellation periods. One of the most structurally interesting features of the dream theory is what it makes of the two cancellation periods, the first from 2002 to 2005, and the second time Fox canceled the show before reversing course. For a show that is supposedly a dream maintained by a grieving dreamer, 2 long interruptions would seem to present a problem. How does a dream pause for 3 years and then resume? What does the dormancy period mean? The theory has a specific answer. Dreams do not simply pause and resume. They go through periods where the dreamer is closer to the surface of wakefulness, closer to the place where the full weight of the real thing that happened presses in on the constructed world, and makes it harder to sustain. The cancellation periods are, in this reading, the times when the weight became too great, when the dream's maintaining intelligence could no longer hold the construction against the pressure of what was actually there. The show disappeared not because the writers left and the network canceled it, but because the dreamer could not maintain the fantasy against what was pressing in from outside it. The 3-year gap between Season 3 and Season 4 is what the dream looked like when it was under maximum pressure, when the outside world was closest, when the thing the dream was built to hold at bay was most nearly arriving. During that gap, the dream was not running. The family was not coming home every week. The yellow house was dark, and then something shifted. The weight redistributed slightly, the dream found its footing again, and the show came back. But it came back different, which is exactly what the theory would predict. A dream that resumes after a long dormancy is not the same dream. It has the same characters and the same setting and the same general architecture, but it has been through the dormancy, and the dormancy leaves marks. The world is slightly harder, slightly more defined at its edges, slightly less fluid and spontaneous. The characters are slightly more extreme because the dreamer, coming back to the construction after a long absence, needs more stimulus to feel the same level of reassurance. The ordinariness that worked in Season 1 no longer produces the comfort it produced then, because the dreamer is further from the beginning now, further from the original warm fog of the early dream, and needs the dream to be louder to feel as secure. This is why the post-revival seasons are, in the specific way they are, different from the original run. Not worse in every respect, some of the post-revival episodes are among the best the show produced, but different in texture, different in the quality of what they are doing, because the dream that produced them was working harder to maintain itself against a pressure that the original dream did not have to work as hard against. The Adult Swim reruns and the DVD sales that built the audience during the gap and eventually brought the show back are, in this reading, the dreamer's own mind, working against the dormancy, maintaining the shape of the dream through the period when it could not be actively sustained, keeping the characters accessible in memory and in cultural circulation, preserving the possibility of return so that when the pressure finally shifted, the dream could be resumed rather than having to be rebuilt from scratch. The family was always there. In reruns during the gap, Peter and Lois and the children and Brian and Stewie in their yellow house on their fictional street, playing and replaying at 2 in the morning on cable television for the people who needed to watch them survive again. This is the dream in its most stripped-down form. Not new episodes, not new catastrophes resolved, but the same old ones. The same episodes over and over. The same coming home, played out again and again for an audience that was keeping the dream alive through the dormancy by refusing to let go of the shape of it. And when the show finally came back in 2005, the shape was still there, exactly as it had been preserved. The family came home. The dream resumed. The dreamer, wherever he was, found the world on the other side of the 3-year gap and stepped back into it. Deeper Dive Season 2 and the shape of unfinished things. There is a specific quality to unfinished things, a particular kind of presence they maintain in the life of the person who was supposed to finish them. A novel that has been unfinished for years takes up more space in the daily life of the person who is supposed to be writing it than a finished novel would. It is present as absence. It occupies the mental square footage of a thing that has been postponed indefinitely, a guilt-shaped space that gets visited every day, however briefly, and whose visit produces a small, specific, consistent discomfort that is familiar enough to have become part of the background texture of daily experience. Brian's novel is this kind of presence in his life. It is not simply a project he has not gotten around to. It is the organizing failure of his identity. He is a writer. He has been a writer for the entire run of the show. The identity depends on the novel's existence as a possibility, as a thing that will one day be finished and submitted and judged and, in the best version of the outcome, validated. As long as the novel is unfinished, the identity is preserved. The validation has not yet been sought, and therefore it has not yet been refused. The writer Brian is still possible, as long as the novel is still in progress. The moment the novel were finished would be the moment of maximum exposure. Finishing would require submitting, and submitting would require accepting the verdict of the outside world. And the outside world's verdict might be, probably would be, given the track record of self-help books hastily written to exploit a brief celebrity, that the novel is not what writer Brian believes it is. The protection against this verdict is the incompletion. The incompletion preserves the possibility without requiring the test. Season 2 is where this mechanism is established, and it is established with enough clarity that the audience can follow it forward through every subsequent season without needing it to be re-explained. The novel comes up, the embarrassment or the defensiveness is registered, and the novel retreats back to wherever it lives in the unreachable portion of Brian's desk. And the question of what kind of writer Brian actually is gets deferred for another season. The deferral is not passive, it is active. It requires ongoing maintenance, the maintenance of the pretense that the novel is still being worked on, still in progress, still the thing that will eventually be what writer Brian believes it will be. This maintenance is a form of daily labor, small enough to be invisible most of the time but constant enough to contribute to the general exhaustion of being Brian Griffin, the specific exhaustion of someone who is spending significant energy every day managing the distance between who they believe themselves to be and what they are actually producing. By the time the show reaches its later seasons and the novel has been unfinished for 15 or 16 years of narrative time, the maintenance of the fiction has become so normalized that it barely registers as effort. It is simply part of the background texture of being Brian, like the drinking, like the specific flatness when the mother comes up, like the reflexive defensiveness when anyone with specific knowledge of his actual accomplishments is in a position to compare them to his stated identity. All of it normalized, all of it invisible, all of it part of the daily cost of living with the unfinished things. Deeper Dive Season 3, and what the failure protects. The theory about Stewie's displacement behavior becomes more precise when you consider not just what the failure of each plan produces, but what the failure protects. Because the theory argues that the failures are not simply the narrative convenience of keeping Lois alive for story purposes. The failures are Stewie protecting himself from the thing that completing the plan would produce. What would completing the plan produce? On the surface, the answer seems obvious. It would produce Lois's death, the disruption of the family, the end of the specific relationship between Stewie and his mother that the plans are aimed at. These are the surface-level consequences, and they are bad enough. But the theory is interested in a deeper level of consequence, what the completion of the plan would do to the specific psychological need that the plan was built to address. If the plan is, as the theory argues, a displaced communication of the need to be known, then completing the plan would terminate the possibility of the need ever being met. You cannot be known by someone you have destroyed. You cannot receive the contact you have been asking for from someone who is no longer there to give it. The completion of the plan would produce not the satisfaction of the underlying need, but the permanent foreclosure of its possibility. And this is what Stewie, at some level perhaps not conscious, perhaps operating entirely below the register of the villain's speeches, and the technical schematics cannot bring himself to do. The failure protects the possibility. As long as the plan fails, as long as Lois is still alive, there is still the chance. The chance that something will shift. The chance that the connection the weapons were asking for will be made through different means. The chance that Lois will do the things she does in the brief moments, scattered through Season 3 where she is specifically, genuinely, warmly present to him as the particular person he is, and that this time the warmth will persist, will not be interrupted, will be the thing that finally establishes the contact that the whole project was built around trying to provoke. The failure, understood this way, is not a flaw in the plan. It is the plan's most essential feature. The plan cannot succeed because succeeding would eliminate the possibility the plan was built to preserve. And Stewie, genius that he is, in the specific and perhaps not entirely conscious way that motivation shapes behavior below the level of explicit reasoning, ensures that the plan does not succeed. Ensures it repeatedly, consistently, across 3 seasons, until the show's cancellation gave the character 3 years of dormancy in which to arrive, slowly, at the understanding of what he had actually been building all along. Deeper Dive Season 4 and the Missing Consequence. The theory about Peter's transformation through the petarded diagnosis gains important texture when you consider the specific role that Consequence played in the early seasons and trace what happened to Consequence as the diagnosis created room for its removal. In the early seasons, consequences were not always present. This is a comedy, and comedies often dispose of consequences for narrative convenience. But when consequences were present, They were present in a specific way. They were felt by Peter, registered by Peter, and to some degree used by Peter as the basis for a small and usually imperfect but genuine attempt at change or repair. The consequence was not just a plot event, it was an emotional event. It moved through Peter and changed something in him, however temporarily, before the next episode reset the slate. Post-Petarded, consequences increasingly fail to become emotional events. They remain plot events, things happen as a result of Peter's actions. The show acknowledges them, but the passage through Peter that would convert them from external facts into internal responses stops occurring with reliability. The consequence lands, and Peter does not register it, or registers it as humor rather than as the weight it carries for the person on the other end of the damage. The mechanism that converted external consequence into internal feeling, the mechanism that made Peter a person rather than just a character, has been removed, and the Petarded diagnosis is the theory's identification of the specific narrative moment when the permission to remove it was established. The consequence problem is also the heart of what makes the later seasons harder to watch, in the specific way they are harder to watch. When consequences become purely external when they happen, but do not move through the character's interior and come out, Change the comedy of bad decisions becomes a different kind of comedy. It becomes the comedy of watching someone break things without caring that they are broken. This can be funny in a very specific and very limited register shock comedy, transgression comedy, the comedy of witnessing someone do something you would never do and could never get away with. But it is not the comedy of the early Peter Griffin, which was warmer and stranger and based on the specific absurdity of someone who meant well and consistently did damage anyway. The warmth was what made the early comedy work. The consequence mechanism was what maintained the warmth. Remove the mechanism and the warmth drains away, and what is left is transgression without context. The Petarded episode opened the drain. It did not drain the warmth all at once. The drain was slow, a gradual, seasonal lowering of the level, barely perceptible from one episode to the next, but unmistakable when you compare where the level was in Season 1 to where it was in Season 12. Deeper dive Season 5 and the performance that nobody asked for. The Quagmire theory becomes most interesting at the point where it asks, what does it cost a person to perform a role that was not externally assigned to them, that they chose, and that they maintain without acknowledgement or credit, or the possibility of stepping out of it? The answer the theory offers is precise. It costs you the version of yourself that exists when the performance is not required. Not the alternate timeline version, not the Molly Ringwald timeline, Quagmire, who is content in a different way. But the version of yourself that exists in the moments between performances, in the gaps when the persona is not being actively maintained, in the interior space of the person who is playing the role, rather than being it. Quagmire, the theory argues, has a private self that is substantially different from the public persona. The persona is the lecherous neighbor, the running gag, the character, the other characters in the show, and the audience understand him to be. The private self is the person the alternate timeline briefly made visible, someone with the capacity for sustained commitment, for domestic contentment, for the specific form of happiness that comes from building a life that fits who you are rather than occupying a role in someone else's story. The cost of the performance, across the show's run, is the progressive distance that develops between those two versions. The performance becomes more practiced and more fluent over time. This is how all sustained performances work. But the fluency is purchased at the expense of the private self's availability. The more practiced the performance, the more difficult it becomes to step out of it, even in the moments when the performance is not strictly required. The persona becomes the default, and the private self becomes a guest in its own house. This is not a dramatic or theatrical form of loss. It is not experienced as grief in the acute sense. It is the specific kind of loss that happens so gradually and so functionally that by the time you might notice it, it has been happening for long enough that it has become part of what being you feels like. Quagmire's particular form of this loss is visible, the theory argues, in the specific way he occupies his scenes in the later seasons, with a competence and a fluency that reads as comfort, but that the theory reads as the competence of someone who has done the performance so many times that the performance is what remains most readily available. The alternate timeline in the Season 5 finale was the show briefly reversing the process. briefly putting the private self where the persona usually is, and letting the audience and Quagmire both see what was underneath. And then the timeline was restored and the persona was restored with it, and the brief visibility of the thing underneath made the performance afterwards slightly, perhaps infinitesimally, more legible as a performance rather than as a natural state. Deeper Dive Season 6 and the Ongoing Experiment. The simulation theory's most interesting implication is not about the specific characters or the specific seasons, but about the nature of the show as an ongoing creative project. If the show from Season 7 onward is Stewie's simulation running, then it is not a story being told, but an experiment being conducted. And the specific methodology of the experiment is visible in the ways the later seasons differ from the early ones. An experiment tests variables. It changes things one at a time and observes the results. It does not require the test subjects to be consistent across runs. In fact, consistency would undermine the test, because what the experiment is trying to measure is the effect of the variable change, not the baseline behavior. The inconsistency that critics correctly identify in the later seasons' characters who do not hold their previous characterization from episode to episode, relationships that develop and reset without consequence, moments of genuine growth or connection that fail to carry forward is the experimental signature. It is what a simulation designed to test specific variables looks like from the outside. What variables is Stewie testing? The theory proposes several. He tested the configuration where Stewie is a committed villain, in the first run of the simulation that the Season 6 two-parter depicts. He tested configurations where the friendship with Brian takes different forms and reaches different depths. He tested configurations where Peter's cognitive functioning is at different levels, where Meg's position in the family dynamic is more or less extreme, where the group of friends at the Drunken Clam has different compositions. The Cleveland departure and return is a variable test. Each change produces different data. The data is what the show produces season by season. This reading gives the later seasons a coherence that the straightforward quality decline reading denies them. They are not simply getting worse. They are different experimental conditions. They are the simulation exploring the parameter space of possible Griffin family configurations, looking for the combination that produces the specific outcome Stewie is trying to understand. What outcome? The theory does not specify, but the unfinished sentence from the end of Season 6 is still being spoken, one season at a time, and whatever it was going to say is what the simulation is still working toward. Deeper Dive, Season 7, and the Territory Between Places. Cleveland's departure from Quahog and his eventual return maps onto a psychological territory that the theory finds significant beyond the specific drama of the character. The territory of the person who has left something and is now negotiating what the leaving means. Leaving a place or a relationship or a configuration of your life does not immediately resolve the question of what that place or relationship or configuration was to you. The leaving creates distance, and distance changes the view. Things that were too close to see clearly while you were inside them become legible from the outside. The exit reveals the shape of what you exited, and the question that the person who has left must answer the question that Cleveland was answering in the theory's reading. Across the 4 seasons of the Cleveland show is whether what the distance reveals looks better or worse from the outside than it looked from within. For Cleveland, the distance revealed something complicated. The thing he left was not simply bad. The friendship with Peter was real. The history on Spooner Street was real. The specific way that place had shaped him, his gentleness, his patience, his particular form of steadiness was real and was not replicated by anything in Stoolbend in quite the same form. The new life was better in specific and important ways. The old life was worse in specific and important ways, and neither of these facts canceled the other. The person who returns to something they left with full knowledge of what they are returning to occupies a different position than the person who never left. They have the comparison. They have the knowledge of the alternative. They are choosing rather than simply continuing. And the choice, made with full information rather than in the absence of alternatives, produces a different quality of presence, a presence that includes, alongside the warmth of the familiar, the specific awareness of what the familiarity costs and the specific decision that the cost is worth paying. This is the most honest version of loyalty available. Not the loyalty of someone who stays because they have never seriously considered leaving, but the loyalty of someone who left, found out what else was possible, and came back anyway. The coming back anyway is what the theory reads as the show's most honest treatment of the complicated love that holds the group together despite all its damage. The love that knows what it costs and pays anyway. Because the alternative, the version of the life where the history and the friendship and the complicated warmth are simply absent, is worse. Deeper Dive, Season 8, and the words said in the dark. The Vault episode's effect on the relationship between Brian and Stewie extends beyond the single episode and beyond the seasons that immediately follow it. It creates a permanent asymmetry in the knowledge each character carries about the other, an asymmetry that changes the fundamental terms of their relationship in ways that are still operating decades later in narrative time. Whenever the show chooses to honor what was established there, Brian knows that Stewie heard something that most people in Brian's life have not been invited to hear and responded to it with specific, genuine, unperformed care. The knowledge that someone has heard the real thing, not the performance, not the persona, not the witty and politically engaged and slightly arrogant version of yourself that you have built and maintained as the primary interface between yourself and the world, changes the nature of the relationship with that person. It makes every subsequent interaction slightly more loaded, slightly more real, because there is now a layer of truth between you that the social performances of your regular interactions are always occurring in the context of. Stewie knows that Brian trusted him with the specific thing he had apparently not trusted anyone else with. He knows that his friendship with Brian is the relationship in Brian's life that is deep enough to contain that specific disclosure. He knows that being the recipient of that disclosure placed a specific and ongoing responsibility in his hands. The responsibility of someone who has been trusted with a real thing to remain worthy of the trust by continuing to be the kind of presence that makes the real thing stayable. The responsibility of the one person who knows. These asymmetric forms of knowledge are what the theory means when it says the friendship after the vault is qualitatively different from the friendship before it. Not necessarily more cheerful or more dramatically visible as a meaningful relationship, the later seasons do not always write the Brian and Stewie dynamic as though the vault happened, and this is one of the later seasons' most significant failures of craft. But the change is real in the logic of the characters' histories. It exists in the material even when it is not being used. And the episodes where it is being used, the Christmas Guy episode, the specific scattered moments when one of them says something true to the other, and the show does not undercut it, are the episodes where what the vault established comes to the surface and makes the friendship visible, as what it actually is, the truest and most complete relationship the show depicts, between the two characters who found in each other the specific thing that everything in their histories had been organizing them to need. Deeper Dive Season 9 and the Weight of Knowing. The theory about Meg's continuous time experience gains additional texture when you examine the specific form that her knowledge takes, the specific way in which knowing what she knows, carrying what she carries, shapes the particular and distinctive quality of her presence in the show's later seasons. Meg's knowledge is not analytical. She is not running a detached assessment of the family's dysfunction, cataloging it, maintaining a critical distance from it. She is inside it, carrying it, living with it as the texture of her daily experience rather than as an object of study. This is what makes her confrontation in the hurricane episode so powerful. She is not delivering a verdict from outside the situation. She is delivering testimony from inside it, from someone who has been inside it continuously for the entire duration of the experience she is describing. The specific quality of testimony differs from analysis in ways that matter for the theory. Analysis can be revised, updated, corrected when new information arrives. Testimony is the account of what was experienced, and what was experienced does not revise. The facts of Meg's experience do not change when they are looked at from a different angle. They are what happened to her. They are in her body, in her posture, in the specific way she holds herself when she enters a room where the people who did those things are present. They are carried, not stored. They are continuous, not historical. This is the distinction the theory draws between Meg and the other characters. The others store their experiences as history, accessible for reference but not continuously present in the texture of the current moment. Meg carries hers as testimony as things that are still happening to her in the specific sense that what was done to her has not been undone, has not been addressed, has not been resolved into the past in any form that would allow her to move beyond it into an authentic present. She is always, simultaneously, in the present and in every moment that created it. The hurricane episode is the moment when the weight of that simultaneous inhabitation becomes temporarily unsustainable, when the testimony pushes out through the careful management and says itself, plainly, to the people who need to hear it. And then it is re-swallowed, the management reasserts. And Meg goes back to carrying what she has always carried, in the way that only she can carry it, because she is the only one who does not get to forget. Deeper Dive Season 10 and the Object in the Room. The theory about Stewie's weapons as psychological projections becomes most interesting when you ask a question the theory has been building toward for several sections. What happens to the projections when the need they represent is finally, even partially met? The Vault episode in Season 8 is the theory's answer. When Stewie tells Brian that he matters when the disclosure is made and received and responded to with specific, genuine, unperformed care, something in the architecture of the displacement behavior changes. Not dramatically, not immediately visible in the following episode's inventory of weapons. But the urgency that drove the construction of those weapons has been, however briefly, reduced. The question has received an answer. The answer was not complete or permanent, but it was real. And a real answer, even a partial and provisional one, changes the relationship between the question and the object it was organized around. The weapons in Season 10 gather dust not because the writers ran out of ideas for them, though that may also be true. They gather dust because their builder has received, for the first time, something that was actually addressed to the need they were built to express. The ray gun is the question I am real. Is anyone paying attention? The answer arrived in a bank vault, from a slightly drunk white Labrador retriever who was telling the truth about something he had not told anyone else. The question received an answer. The object that embodied the question no longer needs to be maintained with the same urgency. This is the theory's most precisely hopeful reading, that the change in Stewie's character across the seasons, which is often read as loss, the loss of the evil genius persona, the loss of the most original character concept in the show's history, is also gain. The gain of a person who has found what they were looking for. Not completely, not permanently. Not in a way that resolves the need or eliminates the anxiety or closes the wound all the way, but partially, genuinely, in the specific and sufficient way that finding the one person who will hear you provides when you have been building weapons to ask for that hearing for as long as you can remember. The weapons are in the room in Season 10. They are still available. They have not been destroyed or discarded or abandoned. They are simply less urgent now, less frequently reached for, less necessary. And the question they were built to ask is being asked in a different form, in a different register, through the specific and ordinary medium of a friendship between a baby who wanted to be known and a dog who stayed. Deeper Dive Season 11 and the House That Holds. The purgatory theory gains its most human dimension when you take the theological weight out of the word and think about what the Griffin House is actually providing for the people who are held within it, what function the holding serves. Why? The architecture of a place that will not release its inhabitants might be a kind of mercy rather than a kind of trap. In the ordinary understanding of purgatory, the holding is punitive. You are here because you are not yet ready for what comes next. And the being here is a form of suffering that is designed to make you ready. But the theory argues that the Griffin House is not punitive, it is protective. The holding is not designed to punish the characters. It is designed to ensure that they do not leave before the thing that would allow them to leave, the full resolution of the love that cannot find its way through, has arrived. What would it look like for the love to finally find its way through? The theory cannot answer this fully, because the show has never allowed the resolution to arrive, and the theory is an analysis of what has been produced rather than a prediction of what might eventually be produced. But it can describe the conditions the resolution would require. A moment in which the love that has been expressed catastrophically across every episode finally finds the right words, the right channel, the right form of expression that lands as what it is, without producing damage at the point of contact. A moment where Peter says something to Lois or to his children that arrives as what he means. A moment where the love is legible rather than decodable, present rather than inferred, real in the specific way of something that has been received, rather than something that had to be excavated from underneath the damage that accompanied it. This moment has never arrived in the main narrative. It has been approximated, approached, briefly touched in the scattered true moments the theory has noted throughout this analysis, but it has never fully arrived. And the house holds its inhabitants for as long as the moment has not arrived, because the dream was built around the possibility of the moment's arrival, and as long as that possibility remains, as long as the story continues, as long as new episodes are generated, as long as the family keeps coming home, the moment might still come. The holding is the hope. The house on Spooner Street holds its people because the hope that the love will finally find its way through is still present, however attenuated, however, buried under 20-plus seasons of noise and escalating damage, and the specific sadness of watching something that was once extraordinary become ordinary, and then less than ordinary. The hope is still there. The yellow house is still on its street. The lights are still on. The family comes home. Deeper Dive Season 12 and beyond. The archive and the monument. The final dimension of the theory about the show's self-awareness in its later seasons is the distinction between what the show became as a creative project and what it remains as an archive. The creative project, the show, as an ongoing endeavor, generating new episodes, attempting new stories, working towards something reached its most honest form in the early seasons and was progressively hollowed out across the middle and later seasons in the ways the theory has described. This is real. The decline is real. The evacuation of the load-bearing warmth is real. The transition from a show made by people who cared about what they were building to a show managed by people who understood its value as an asset is real. These things happened, and they are documented in the material. But what the show also became, across 20-plus seasons, is an archive of a specific and irreplaceable piece of American animated television history. A record of what was possible in the specific cultural moment of its golden years, a monument to the specific combination of sensibility and craft and genuine caring that produced those seasons, and a demonstration of what happens to a creative enterprise when the conditions that produced its best work are no longer reliably present. The archive is not diminished by the decline of the ongoing project. If anything, the decline illuminates the archive, by contrast, by showing clearly what was present in the early seasons that the later seasons were missing, by making visible through its absence the specific quality of attention and caring that produced the Golden Era's best work. The Vault episode is legible as extraordinary, partly because of everything that was produced around it that was ordinary. The early seasons are legible as extraordinary, partly because they are surrounded, in the historical record, by the extended period of relative ordinariness that followed them. The theories in this video are the work the archive rewards. They are what close, sustained, genuinely engaged attention to the early seasons produces the discovery of structures and meanings and resonances that exist in the material and that become visible when the material is held in the right kind of light for long. Enough. The decline did not damage the archive. The archive is intact. The early seasons are still there in their original form, still available to the specific kind of slow attention that finds what the theories find. And what the theories find, in the end, is a story about grief and love and the specific architecture that both produce when they are held together in a space designed to let neither of them resolve. A house on Spooner Street, a dream that will not end, a family that keeps coming home. That is the whole story. That is the whole theory. That is what 20-plus seasons of one of the most loved and most argued about animated comedies in the history of American television is. When you hold it in the right kind of light and look at it long enough and carefully enough, and with enough willingness to find what is actually there rather than what you expected to find. The baby in the yellow shirt built something extraordinary. The dog in the good chair carried something quietly for a very long time. The daughter who could not forget anything told the truth in a hurricane and was asked to take it back. The father whose mind was going kept coming home because the dream would not let him do anything else. They are all still in the house. The dream is still running. The house lights are still on. And somewhere in a nursery at the end of a hallway, a 1-year-old genius with a British accent and a time machine and a collection of weapons that were always really questions is still waiting with the specific patience of someone who has decided that waiting is worth it. For the moment when someone finally looks up and sees him, clearly, that moment has not arrived yet. But the show is still going. The dream is still running. The house is still lit. It might still come. Deeper dive additional context. The show's relationship to its own cancellations. One of the most structurally telling features of Family Guy's history, more telling perhaps than any individual episode or character decision, is the specific way the show treated its own cancellations when it returned from them. Most shows that come back from cancellation make a point of addressing the absence, of acknowledging that something happened, of staging a kind of reunion for the characters and the audience that marks the gap and then moves past it. Family Guy did something more unusual. It treated the revival as though the gap barely existed at all. The fourth season premiere did not open with the characters having experienced 3 years of something. It opened with Peter and the family in medias res, in the middle of the next story, as though the screen had simply been dark for a moment and was now lit again. The dream theory has a specific reading of this choice. In a dream, there is no awareness of the intervals between dreaming. You do not go to sleep, dream for an hour, wake briefly, fall back asleep, dream again, and experience the second dream as a continuation that must account for the gap. The second dream begins where the dreamer's internal logic places it, which is usually in the same world with the same people doing the same kind of things. The gap between the dreams is invisible from inside the second dream. It has no texture, no duration, no narrative weight. It simply did not happen, from the perspective of the person who was not present for it. This is how the show treated its own cancellation periods. The gap did not happen, from the perspective of the Griffin family. They were simply there, and then they were there again. No 3 years had passed. No continuity was broken. The dream resumed from the memory of where it was, without needing to account for the silence in between. This choice, which could be read as simply the pragmatic decision of a writing room that did not want to introduce continuity complications, resonates differently in the context of the theory. It is the dream insisting on its own uninterrupted continuity. It is the organizing intelligence of the constructed world refusing to acknowledge that there were periods when the world was dark, because acknowledging the dark periods would require acknowledging that the world exists at the will of someone outside it, that it is maintained rather than simply real. And a dream that acknowledges its own constructed nature is a dream that begins to dissolve. The Griffin family did not experience the cancellations. They were simply there, always there. And the show, returning from each absence, confirmed this. They had been there all along. The lights were on. The house was where it always was. The dream had never actually stopped. Deeper dive. What the show's renewal through 2028 means. The April 2025 renewal announcement, which extended Family Guy through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, guarantees the show a run to its 30th anniversary. This is a number that means something, and the theory finds it worth examining carefully. 30 years is not simply a long time. It is the specific length of time that allows a cultural artifact to transform from a current event into a historical one, from something happening to something that happened. The people who watched the original run of Family Guy in 1999, who were teenagers or young adults when the show premiered, are now in their 30s and 40s. They have had children who have grown up watching the same show. The show that was new to them is now old to the next generation, which is the specific transformation that turns cultural products into monuments. The show at 30 will be, in a very specific and not entirely comfortable way, the monument to the thing it was at the beginning. The 30th anniversary is the moment when the archive fully displaces the ongoing project, when what the show has been supersedes what it currently is as the primary source of its cultural meaning. And the theories in this video are an expression of that displacement already occurring, even before the anniversary arrives. An investment of close attention and genuine analytical care in the archive of what the show was, rather than in the ongoing project of what the show currently produces. The dream theory's final word on the renewal is this. The dream does not end when it loses the clarity it had at the beginning. It continues, diminished perhaps, less vivid, less organized by the specific and urgent emotional needs that built it in the first place, but continuing. The house on Spooner Street is still on its street in the 2028 to 2029 television season. The family is still coming home. The lights are still on. Whatever the dream was built to hold at bay may never fully arrive as long as the dream is still running. The dreamer has found a way to maintain the construction indefinitely. The show will mark 30 years. The family will still be there. And that, in the end, is what the whole thing was always about. The simple, persistent, unanswerable human need to keep something alive that you cannot bear to lose, to keep the lights on, to watch the family come home, one more week, one more season, one more decade, for as long as the dream can last. Thank you for staying through this entire video. Wherever you are and whatever time it is, I hope this found you well and gave you something to fall asleep thinking about. Like the video if it was worth the time, it genuinely helps. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of careful, slow, long-form content. And leave a comment. It is where you are in the world right now. I will read every one of them. We will find each other in the next one. Deeper dive the show's humor as a delivery system for something real. One of the most persistently misunderstood features of the early Family Guy, and one of the most significant losses in the later seasons, is the specific function that humor was performing in the show's golden years. The humor in seasons 1 through 3 was not an end in itself. It was not the show doing whatever it took to produce laughs. It was a delivery system for something that the show could not say directly, a vehicle through which the real content of the show arrived at the audience without triggering the defenses that direct emotional expression would have activated. This is not an unusual function for comedy. The greatest comedies have always used laughter as a Trojan horse, for feeling they make you laugh first, lower your guard through the laughter, and then deliver something true through the opening the laughter created. The specific warmth of the early Family Guy came from the show's precision in this regard. It knew exactly how much comedy was required to create the opening, and it knew exactly what to put through the opening when the moment arrived. The formula worked like this. An episode would establish a scenario through comedy: Peter doing something catastrophic, the family responding in comedic ways, the situation escalating through increasingly absurd complications. The comedy would build and sustain across most of the episode's runtime, generating genuine laughter and maintaining the audience's engagement. And then, at the end, something true would arrive, a moment of genuine connection between characters, a line of dialogue that was not trying to be funny but was simply honest, a small human moment in the middle of all the cartoon logic that was recognizable as real. The comedy was the setup for the feeling. The laughter was the vehicle. The real content arrived at the end of the ride. The later seasons lost this formula because they lost the sense that anything was supposed to arrive. The comedy became the destination rather than the vehicle. Cutaways were deployed not to create openings for feeling, but simply as content in themselves, funny things happening that were followed by other funny things happening, without any architecture of emotional development underneath. The Trojan horse emptied out. The vehicle kept moving, but there was nothing inside it. This is the specific mechanism of the decline, when you look at it from the inside of the comedy. It is not that the later seasons are less funny in every moment. Some of the later cutaways are as funny as anything the early show produced. It is that the funniness is no longer in service of anything. It is not building toward a feeling. It is not creating an opening for something true. It is simply happening, and then more of it is happening, and then the episode ends. The early seasons used comedy to sneak feeling past your defenses. The later seasons stopped having feeling to sneak, and the comedy was all that remained. Deeper dive the final accounting. Over 12 seasons, 12 theories, 12 ways of looking at the same house on the same street in the same fictional town, this analysis has been building toward a single, unified reading of what Family Guy actually is when you look at it carefully enough and honestly enough. It is a love story told in the wrong genre, about people who love each other in the wrong ways, in a world built by someone who needed them to still exist. The cartoon is the medium. The dysfunction is the texture. The cruelty is the imperfect routing of genuine care through channels that produce damage at the point of contact. The chaos is the maintenance work, the keeping active, the keeping loud, the keeping moving that is required to sustain a dream against the weight of what it is protecting you from knowing. The baby built weapons because he wanted to be seen. The dog drank because he was in the process of becoming someone who was harder to see clearly, and the drinking made that process more bearable in the short term and less reversible over time. The daughter kept the records because she was the only one who could not forget, which made her the only honest witness to the family's actual history. The father's mind was going in ways that produced damage, and the damage was the evidence of the love underneath it, deformed by the losing of the mechanism that used to convert the love into something the family could receive. The house held them all. The dream maintained itself. The light stayed on. 25 years of American television. 25 years of a family coming home. 25 years of love expressed badly enough that you might not recognize it as love unless you looked at it for a very long time. From the right angle, with the willingness to find what is actually there rather than simply what the show presents to you on its surface. This video is that looking. That is what theories are for. The sustained, patient, genuinely engaged act of looking at something until it reveals what it is, underneath what it appears to be, underneath what it was designed to look like, all the way down to the thing that was always really there. The family comes home, the dream keeps running, the house lights stay on. Thank you for watching.